Dude, you're back on.
Hey, it's good to be back.
It is, dude.
It's been too long.
It has been too long. I was just about to say that we just get busy and it's hard. And dude, you're putting out stuff, right? I mean, you got stuff you're doing, and it's one of those things. It's hard to catch up sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you've got, we both got families with, mouths to feed, and just, life never stops, right?
Never stops, dude. I'm glad that you're on though, because I've been wanting to cover this for a while, right? And perhaps even more than Adam God or any of those other old time doctrines, this one is especially esoteric, and this one is especially not talked about much. And so, as I was looking at trying to piece something together to talk about the law of adoption, um, your name kept coming up. And I was like, yeah, he's probably my guy for this. And so I'm super jacked, and I'm glad you're here, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. This was actually one of the, as you're starting to journey into the early teachings, this principle was actually one of the significant principles that made me realize that something was missing in what the church has preserved. I mean, God bless the church for all the good that they do preserve of the restoration. But when you're learning about the teachings that were in the early days, you learn about Adam God, and you realize there's a lot bigger picture of our Heavenly Father's relationship with us. You learn about rebaptism and all these other different little practices or pieces of knowledge that pertain to the fullness of the gospel. For me, when I learned about adoption, the one of the common ways it's described in the church is, oh, they didn't really understand what they were doing back then, but fortunately Woodruff was able to get it all figured out, and we're all great now. Nothing really to look back there. It's kind of one of the common apologetics I've heard about adoption. But then it was interestingly, it was a friend who kind of pointed out that Woodruff, when he's doing away with it, is kind of saying we don't really understand this as much as we should understand it, and so I don't want anyone to basically practice this if we don't, until more revelation, more knowledge is would be given. And so this friend kind of, and I was like, huh, that's very different than what I've been told, growing up about, or understood about what was going on back then. And so that started me kind of deep diving into the early teachings about the sealing principles and temple ordinances, and realizing there's just a whole nother world of the temple doctrines that hasn't been preserved in mainstream Mormonism. I don't know if you've similarly had the door open to you, realizing there's a whole world of knowledge about the temple that the church hasn't really preserved.
No, no, and not just in covenant either, right? Um, there is not only have they lost the just whole parts of the temple ceremony and the temple liturgy and certain covenants, but they really have lost the meaning of it, right? Um, every once in a while, when I was in the LDS Church, again, I was a weekly temple attender. Every once in a while, you'd bump into some old guy who was working at the temple, and I'd make sure that after the session, I stopped to pick his brain, because most of the time, those old guys they had a little something that they could remember, right? That mom or grandpa had told them, and but you're right. I mean, not only have we lost whole parts, but we've lost the interpretation of it, right? The original ideas behind it. And that's damaging, right? It would be like jumping in the car and going for a drive and not knowing where you're going. You might see some cool stuff along the way, but you're not going to reach your destination.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt the same way talking to older, people who are older who remember what earlier versions of the ordinances were like. And in fundamentalism, you've talked about it, I've talked about it, how there's been kind of, there was this long period of, just focusing on plural marriage, doing the best we can until the church is set in order, is kind of what many early fundamentalists took the attitude. And there was a loss of being
Hmm.
a temple worshiping people. And if we're really trying to, perpetuate the fullness of the gospel, we that is a big piece of the fullness of the gospel, that you can't be ignorant of there being this, the temple, and still be claiming to be perpetuating everything that Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor taught, because that was a big emphasis in their day. And it's, a very important aspect of the restored gospel.
I go
Right. And
back
so I
to,
think,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
and so I would say that regardless of what branch of the restoration we're in, like there's a lot of knowledge that, has been preserved in different channels, like you said, with older people in some cases having knowledge about how things used to be, different people having different historical access to different resources, to different insights. And so I think it's very valuable to have conversations, respectful conversations, not being disrespectful about anything that is sacred, but to have these dialogues about the temple doctrines in order to better understand, what Joseph Smith and his worthy contemporaries were trying to teach. So,
Absolutely. Well, dude, let's just get into it. Law of adoption.
yeah. So I guess the easiest way to term it, it's commonly referred to as sealing men to men in
Hmm.
early Mormonism, is what it was called. And it was not, unfortunately, with modern culture, there's people who would want to twist that to be mean something that it's not,
Right.
and there's people who don't understand what was going on, that would say, oh, what I've I'm uncomfortable with that kind of language. But what they overwhelmingly said was that there needs to be connections in the chain of the priesthood, and father son connections in the chain of the priesthood, from Adam all the way to the last worthy descendant to be born on earth. And so, this is a major aspect of the temple doctrines that were introduced in Nauvoo. And it was practiced extensively on the Trek West, where they were, it played a very vital role to the union and facilitating the Saints really being a real united family on the Trek West. And then it kind of faded out in early Utah, kind of in the absence of a temple, where they didn't have a temple for many years. And so Brigham's kind of said, we're going to wait until we have another temple to start teaching these things, again. And he dies the year the St. George Temple is completed, but it's still on his mind throughout the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. That's once they get the temples going in Pioneer, Utah, that's a major aspect of the temple doctrines. And so this is one of the most fascinating aspects of church history to me. And but at the same time, the more I research it, the more I realize there's so much more research to be done on the sealing principles in early Mormonism. I hope that what I've gathered can be beneficial to other people, but even then, I admit the limitations of my own knowledge and research, and acknowledge there's a ton more that can be done. And that's what's really exciting to me, is to
Yeah.
realize that there's always more research to be done on these topics. So,
Let me see.
um,
But before we go too much farther, I do want to make sure that the audience understands what this is, right? And I'm going to lay out a scenario here, and if this sounds incorrect, Jacob, please correct me. But from what I understand is that, let's say you are a guy who's coming into Mormonism with your family, and the rest of your family has been like, well, good luck with that crazy stuff, right? We don't want no part of that. So you're going to go out west, right? And look, going out west back then was not like going out west today, right? You cannot make that drive in 2 days and be in air conditioning, right? It's literally going to another country. So you may never see your ancestors again, right? And so one of the vital roles that the law of adoption filled, right? And we'll talk about the doctrine of it in a second, but the practice kind of was is that the head of that family would be sealed to another man as a patriarchal son. Is that correct? And
yeah,
so
that
then
yeah.
then it would be kind of the patriarchal father's responsibility to look after this man and his family. Is that a quick and dirty kind of synopsis of this?
Yeah, the way I look at it, and I really like that terminology there. And I think that, you know, I really think that the purpose is, there are multiple purposes, but I think two of the big purposes were being linked to someone who can teach you
Yep.
more about those principles so that you can become like God, to teach you those principles pertaining to exaltation and help you along the path. And I think the other thing was about, having this real connection with the saints, this idea that the saints were to be a united family. I think was a very real aspect of Zion as Brigham envisioned it, as Joseph envisioned it, where they wanted the saints to be one, as Jesus said, if ye are not one, ye are not mine. Or that's actually the DNC right there. But in Jesus's last prayer in John 17, it was, he was praying for the union of his disciples. And so one of the things that I can see that some people get very uncomfortable with this because they can think of it as, oh, am I throwing away my family relationships
Hmm.
by this principle? And that seems to be a reoccurring concern that this is about. But I don't, I think that would be misunderstanding it, just as I would think that somebody reading the New Testament where Jesus emphasized, your commitment to the gospel, superseding, familial commitments in some ways, that some people think that, oh, Jesus was saying, uh, throw away your family. I don't think that isn't the correct interpretation of Jesus's words. I don't think that adoption was about throwing away your family, but it was about gaining a new extended family is kind of the way
Right.
that I would look at it. And so, I just to kind of go back to the endowment, because I really like something you mentioned in a previous discussion you had where you said that the endowment is like Ellis Island to get you into citizenship in a way into this new country. But then you said that you use the analogy of following the Spirit and being taught by the Spirit is a way to learn the language. I really like that analogy, and I'd say that adoption in a way is like having a sponsor in that country to
Mm.
take you in and help integrate you into that new society. If we're talking about the kingdom of God as like a literal kingdom, where we're supposed to have real relationships. Um,
That's
but
good.
with the in-depth, one of the things I'd say with the sealing principles, when we talk about eternal family in like mainstream LDS context, at a surface level, it sounds all good. It sounds great. The kind of slogan, families are forever. Don't you want to see your family again? That's how they sell you on, joining and going, becoming temple worthy and going through the temple. I think that's all good and right. I mean, that's not bad at like as an entry level introduction to like the eternal family doctrine. Like, I'm not saying that's wrong. It's very similar to when we're talking about there's different layers to understanding the atonement. As an example, there's a very simplistic explanation you might give to a child where you say it's like the one child is good and the other children are all bad, and the one child gets, is willing because he loves the other children to take the punishment, and so the
Right.
other ones are and that's a good analogy for a child. But then as you grow up and you become more mature and thinking about the atonement, you realize that doesn't quite scratch all the nuance of having of understanding the atonement. Like, there's a lot more to it. There's transformative aspects to it, and there's a lot richer understanding of it available for those who really seek to gain a deeper understanding of the atonement. And similarly, I'd say with the sealing principles, the idea of eternal families that you can see your loved ones again is a great introduction. But then if you start to have that simplistic view, if you stay there, you might encounter problems or bumps down the road. Say if you have family members, like if your spouse loses their faith, or you have children who go astray, there's people that are like, well, that makes it almost seem divisive. Is kind of, I don't know if you've ever had conversations with people about the eternal family and sealings where they're like, well, this can be a divisive thing if there are family members who aren't, worthy and aren't, living up to those covenants.
Y- y-
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and look, I'll say this too. I can't remember what section of the Doctrine and Covenants in. I think it's 130 or 131. You can correct me if I'm wrong here. It's a curse I have. I can remember what I read. I can never remember where I read it. Um, but in one of those sections it talks about, and this is before 132, right? And Joseph's basically the Lord tells Joseph the same sociality that exists here exists on the other side, only with greater felicity and glory. Okay. And so I look at that and I say, okay, so maybe 132 isn't about the separation from your loved ones if they mess up, right? There seems to be something else at work here. And I don't think it was anything that was developed nefariously, but I do think it was an oversimplification of the eternities that led to the ability, and I'm going to call it like I see it here a little bit, that the LDS Church could almost kind of hold your family for ransom, right? So if you or any of your family split up, or if I shouldn't say split, if somebody didn't went a different direction religiously, well, gosh, now you're gonna be missing a kid in heaven, right? You're not gonna see that kid ever again. And I'm not sure I buy that, right? Um, I think you
It,
will
it
have.
kind of it, it kind of flies in the face of the quote. Like, I don't know if you remember where Anne Hatch shared the quote where Orson F. Whitney recalled Joseph Smith
Yes.
saying, if you are worthy, you will continue to be able to reach out and to, keep, you know, th- don't give up on your children. You will be able to keep that relationship and keep extending, the offers of repentance and full salvation if they, if as long as you keep your covenants, it will be able to bless your family, if even if they don't, that you will be able to, there's a very fascinating and powerful thing there with the sealing principles and the
Yep.
authority of the priesthood that extends beyond just yourself and your merit, your spouse,
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I have heard that before, and like I said, I think it's twofold. I think that, and again, I don't think it started from a nefarious place. I think it's probably started from a place of oversimplification a little bit, and that lent itself to some really nasty things down the road.
Mhm. Yeah, and I definitely don't think it's always, I don't necessarily think that there's bad will in that perspective, but I do think that it can be weaponized in a way, and especially, I don't know if people have been in fundamentalist groups or in the church where people have used that as a weapon to say,
Yeah.
if you don't go the certain path, you are going to lose your family,
Yep.
and that's, I think that's a total abuse
I do too.
of what was being taught in the early days.
I
And
do too.
so, so we have this issue there with, weaponizing the eternal family. I would say with the endowment, I think it's almost cheapened in some way, the endowment, where people, and this has kind of probably contributed in many ways to the endowment being watered down in the church over the years, is if it's becoming about selling this eternal family, and we want to get as many people as fast as they
Hmm.
can, or, into the temple, regardless of how real serious they are in their commitment to the gospel. They've kind of, it makes a lot of people kind of, who go there, who aren't really prepared to go
Yes.
there, and so
100%.
I mean, I've talked to people who are in the mainstream LDS church who kind of feel like the endowment has in many ways been cheapened by appealing to what would be the lowest common denominator of church members, rather than being something that's sacred and for those church members who are striving for exaltation in the celestial kingdom.
Dude,
Like,
that's 100% correct. And look, you should always be willing to make the ordinances available if they qualify, right? And I'm not saying that from a place of wanting to hoard ordinances or hoard power. It's quite the opposite. I don't want to hurt people. right? And if you have people go in and take those covenants and they're not ready, that can do all sorts of damage, right? And
Yep.
so I do think that that is a huge problem. And I
Yeah,
want to say this:
yeah.
there was a great quote by Thomas Paine in I don't think it was Common Sense. What was the pamphlet he wrote during this Revolutionary War? Oh, I'm blanking.
Oh,
It's gonna drive me.
that's your area of
That's
history,
gonna
not
drive
mine.
me nuts. Getting old sucks.
Uh,
But anyway, it's the one that talks about the sunshine soldier and the fair weather patriots. But he basically says heaven knows best how to affix a price to her goods, right? And I think that with the endowment, you want it available, but you also want people reaching for it, right? Because there is tremendous growth. I'll just use a story here. I remember when Amber and I were working really hard to get to the temple when we were in the LDS Church. And I mean, those were some of the more spiritual times in my life because we were like on a mission, right? We were going to live our best lives and get there. And those were some of the most spirit-filled times in our lives as a couple because we were working for that common goal. And I think sometimes we're selling people short by not letting them go through the process.
mm-mm. And this was one. So I really think that, the temple is, which has been sold as a way to have your family eternally, is, the temple really is about becoming a god. It's learning how to
Hmm.
become a god is the real ultimate purpose of the temple. And one of the fruits of becoming a god is that you will have those relationships continue, and the
Yes.
blessings that flow from those relationships continue. But, that's kind of confusing the byproduct with the process that gives you those blessings. And so, yeah, absolutely, the blessings should be available to those who are, prepare and qualify. But, we also need to be careful that they aren't becoming too common where people are getting them who really don't really care about them or don't,
Right.
aren't prepared to understand them. And so then it could in some ways be a very big stumbling block for them. And so, yeah, so getting back to the eternal, how this kind of ties with the eternal family doctrine. So, eternal family sounds great to people who have a good family relationship, right? If you really loved your parents, if you really had a good relationship with them, if you have a good relationship with your spouse and your children, that is an incredible selling point of the restored gospel. The idea that these relationships can continue into eternity. But then you get into where you get into problems are when people have very broken and
Hmm.
in some cases very uh, poor family relationships where there may be neglect, there may be abuse, there may be mistreatment. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, unfortunately, in families. And when you have cases of those, unfortunate family situations, eternal family isn't a really good selling point in the gospel for those people, because they're like, so if even if my dad did terrible things to his family and lived absolutely unworthy of his calling as a father, and I reach out, I feel terrible for people who've had family situations like that. He's like, you know, how does it make sense for that he's going to be like my father in the celestial kingdom if he is not living,
Hmm.
if he did not live in a way to merit, that where I don't even think that, you know, he would even want it, even if he had the opportunity. And so there's a lot of unfortunate broken family situations where um that just isn't a good selling point. And that's really how I would introduce the law of adoption to someone is that the gospel isn't so not everyone is going to go to the celestial kingdom. Like we understand that the celestial kingdom, Jesus says, it's straight is the way and narrow the gate to those who enter it. And that's repeated all over the scriptures. And so the purpose of adoption wasn't so much about being able to see your family in the eternities. It was about establishing a relationship with someone who you understand is going to go to this, who's not just probably going to the celestial kingdom based on their choices and their values in this life and their example to others, the light that shines from how they live the gospel, but it was also um, about somebody that's leading you on the path to go to the celestial kingdom. So a quote that I, like by Heber C. Kimball, he said, "If we are righteous and keep faithful all the commandments of God, we, with all that portion of our wives and children who have also been faithful, will go into the celestial inheritance prepared for us in the presence of our God. Will the unfaithful, disobedient, and unbelieving of our families enter into us with us into the celestial kingdom? They will not." He said, "As the Lord said to Ezekiel, Son of man, the house of Israel to me has become dross. So with our unbelieving and disobedient of our families and of this people, they will be separated from the pure silver to occupy a place in the mansions of our Father according to their worth." And that doesn't mean you won't be able to see them, but they're just not going to be there in that
Right.
celestial family order. And so really what Joseph Smith was teaching about the celestial family or eternal sealings doctrine was about we need to establish an organization of the saints who are linked together to going towards the celestial kingdom is what the goal was there. And the doctrine was actually that Joseph Smith received the same blessing that Abraham did to be the father of the faithful to this dispensation. And so they taught that all the saints needed to be linked in worthy family lines going back to Joseph Smith, who would, and Joseph is linked to, back. There were different opinions about who Joseph would be linked to. I've actually had somebody ask me recently about, what sources I have on that. And, there's a statement by Brigham Young saying that Joseph would be sealed to someone, but it would take revelation by the keys of Elijah to do that linking. There's other statement that I kind of like by Daniel Tyler, and there's some other statements go along the same lines where he says that Joseph would be linked to Christ and then Christ to God the Father. And that's how we in this last dispensation are, linked back to Adam
Hmm.
is kind of, and I really respect that view. And my personal opinion that somebody who is a missionary investigating, the fullness of the gospel and fundamentalism, um, he kind of made this he shared this idea and I've always liked it since. He said, so right before Joseph has the keys of Moses, Elias, and Elijah restored to him in the Kirtland Temple in 1836, and those keys are the keys pertaining to the temple and the
Right.
temple blessings, right? So right before that, Christ appears and Christ accepts the temple and he appears to Joseph and Oliver. And so this missionary suggested, he says, do you think it's possible that maybe Christ was there in the temple to seal Joseph to himself at that time? And I said, I can't prove it one way or the other, but I really like that idea. And that would make a ton of sense to me that Joseph would be linked, before he would
Mm-hmm.
start linking other people to himself is kind of and so that's not,
Yeah.
something that's binding on anyone to have to think that idea, but that
Right.
idea stood out to me and I've resonated with it ever since. And so this is the quote by Daniel Tyler that I referenced. This is in the Juvenile Instructor, which was a magazine for the youth of the church. And so it's really great to get, if you're ever interested in to know what, George Buchanan and other church leaders during the 1880s wanted to teach the youth of the church, you know, go read the Juvenile Instructor. So this was in an article, series of articles explaining the temples by Daniel Tyler. He wrote, quote, "Children will be adopted to their parents if their parents are worthy, if not to others, unless born in the sealing covenant. The parents to other faithful men, and so on to Joseph, and lastly, all the worthy to Jesus, thus making one great family of the saints in all ages and dispensations." And so often people will quote kind of the antagonistic sources that say that would explain that doctrine and explain that you're
Right.
being linked to your parents if they're faithful or to other faithful men if your parents weren't faithful, and then back to Joseph. And I just like that that's in a official magazine for the youth of the church
That's
teaching
yeah.
that. And
Boy,
you
we
know,
need more
so
gospel teaching like that to the youth, don't we?
oh, absolutely. If somebody wanted to
Whew.
do, I've heard that there are descendants of George Buchanan that have tried to do like a continuation of the juvenile instructor, but it'd be nice to have like a fundamentalist,
Yeah, it would.
trying to teach the fullness of the gospel to the youth,
Come on, Jacob, you're not that busy. You can pick that up.
Oh, if only I didn't have a million other
I know. I know. I'm
projects I
just
wish
giving
I
you a
could
hard
work on,
time.
but it is, a great idea, that would be. And so here's a quote by Heber C. Kimball, kind of teaching adoption in winter quarters. And this quote is in the Journal of Joseph Hovey on March 24th, 1847. And so he's talking to his adopted family who are all linked to him. He said, I'm your father or counselor or teacher. Some say it's clipping a man's privilege to be sealed to the 12. It does not, for it does not take any privileges away from him, but rather gives him more. It would not do a man any good to be sealed to another, no matter if he was ever so good and great, unless a man that was sealed obeyed the commandments and tried to be a good and wise and proved to all about them that they were noble souls. And so, that being honest and true, that being virtuous. So one of the big emphasis when adoption became taught and the sealings were being taught was some people are getting a mistaken idea that it's who you're sealed to
Right.
that makes you great. Like, oh, if you're sealed to and even with women, the idea was, oh, if you're just sealed to a righteous man, or a leader, that guarantees your exaltation. And they push back heavily against that idea where they're saying, nope, it's not going to change anything for you unless you are living worthy, for those blessings. And
I always
so,
said that sort of thought there, and I've read those accounts before and the pushback. And to me, it always struck me as kind of like Mormons flirting with indulgences, right? Like just be sealed to the right guy and you can go do what you need to do and you're gonna be okay. Right? And nothing can be farther from the truth. You're still judged based on what you do.
yep, absolutely. And so he continues, he says, now I will show you a figure or example. You can graft a great many kinds of fruit to one tree, and not after the fruit of that tree, for in the limb you graft a greening apple, you will have a greening apple. In the limb, you put a Baldwin graft, and you will have a Baldwin apple. Therefore, you see a number of fruits can be raised from one tree. Your lineage is the same and does not curtail your fathers or yourself. You will see some small branches and some larger ones grow onto that. And so he's basically saying your fruit is going to still be your fruit, regardless of where you're connected in this
Mm.
tree, in this family tree.
So that
So
would kind
that
of if I'm understanding correctly, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. This was kind of a way of alleviating that fear of if you're sealed into somebody else's family, you're never going to see your parents again. Am I picking that up correctly?
Yeah, yeah, and we'll get
Okay.
into probably the original understanding of work for the dead later on in this discussion, which is going to be, I think, a big, piece of the puzzle to
Hmm.
understanding what was, how this all fits together. But so continuing, he says, this is the principle of oneness that this people will have to go into in order to help build one another up. If you help me, surely I can help you. Therefore, we must work for one another's interests. And so with adoption, one of the problems that kind of came up was this jealousy or this idea of so there's the term kingdom building that was
Hmm.
used in the early days where they talked about the kingdom building doctrine where men who had authority of the fullness of the priesthood could, have a kingdom sealed unto themselves by virtue of the sealing power they possess. And, that could be a good thing in one context, but it can be totally misused in a different context. I think you and I have talked, in other, not in public discussions, but just privately about, issues where people almost take this doctrine of having people sealed to you as like a multi-level marketing where they're trying to aggrandize
Yep.
themselves by having other people linked to them. And that's absolutely an incorrect understanding of this doctrine. It was never about self-aggrandizement, is and this is something that they stressed over and over again. That this it doesn't it's not so much about, you know how many people are linked to you, but it's about how righteous you are being. And the kingdom building doctrine, I think the correct way of looking at it kind of comes from Brigham Young said, you got to love the truth because it is the truth, and righteousness because it is right, not because it gives you great power and authority and gives you how all this power and influence over other people. You need to love it because just because it's because of the virtue in and of itself, not because of what it does for you. And he says the only people who are truly worthy to have others sealed to them are those who lose themselves in seeking after righteousness because of its being righteous, not because of whatsoever, of what it might do to empower them, if that makes sense. And
Makes
so
makes total sense.
the way I see exaltation is not about self-aggrandizement, but it's the way the early brethren taught exaltation was you're exalted by having a family, but it's a byproduct of living
Hmm.
according to celestial principles. Like they would stress that it's not the number of wives that you have sealed to you. It's, are you being righteous? Are you living the right way and creating a celestial family in the way
Yep.
that you are living with your wives and your children? And if you aren't, it doesn't matter how many people, how much are sealed to you, because you're not going to be able to, um, retain them. If you're not going to live in a way to, you know, striving to, um, live according to the celestial law and to purify your character and sanctify yourself to be worthy to become a god, then it doesn't matter how many people are sealed to you. And so I think exaltation should be viewed as a byproduct, rather than something that you're seeking after just to aggrandize yourself. And I think,
No,
yeah, I
I
don't know if you have something you want to say on that.
yeah, I think so. There, back to our private conversations on that. As I've looked at this doctrine a couple different times, there seems to be two schools of thought, right? Those who are maybe looking for self-aggrandizement, they'll look at having people other families sealed to them as a mark of um, righteousness, self-aggrandizement. Look at where I can get to, sort of a thing. Then there's another school of thought that I like a lot better, which is very consistent with the rest of priesthood, right? Every time we ascend as men in a priesthood office, there is a greater responsibility to serve, right? And likewise, I see this being a continuation of that. And so those who I think that were really wise about it weren't necessarily centered on the self-aggrandizement portion, but were more centered on how can I serve these people better to help them get where they want to be, right? What's my role as a servant to this person and his family to get them where they want to be? I think if you approach it that way, you're starting out from a better place, and certainly outcomes are never guaranteed, but you at least start off on the right foot. And this idea of self-aggrandizement, Joseph had an interesting thing to say about this. He said, um, the idea of self-aggrandizement, and I'm paraphrasing here, isn't altogether bad as long as you're seeking to bring everybody with you, right?
Mhm.
And I think what we see in the law of adoption is that effort of bringing people with you, right? Get lost in the work and then bring others along that want to be lost in the work as well.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and Brigham Young kind of said in Winter Quarters, he said that he was boarding like 40 families. He was
Hmm.
helping support, he says, I'm not even really well off at this point, and I'm helping to support other people. And I hope that this will eventually be other people also helping to support me, and so that I can eventually, live in the house of the Lord and administer blessings to my brethren, kind of was what he was envisioning. It was this there's this responsibility to it. It's not about glorifying yourself, but it's about the responsibility of helping others and being, that servant leader as Christ taught. You need to be concerned about their well-being. And the other thing that they kind of talked about and they really kind of stressed about adoption in Winter Quarters was you shouldn't ever pressure anyone to be
Mm-mm.
adopted into someone. It needs to come from a natural affinity. And Brigham would say, I have never asked someone to be adopted to me. He says people who've been adopted to me have done so because they've asked to be. They are the ones who are putting forth that initiative and desiring. And I, we've kind of talked about, how in the church there's a lot of people who have really great spiritual mentors in the LDS Church,
Hmm.
who when they're starting to become, you know, or converts especially,
Yeah.
but even people who are raised in the gospel, they'll have a spiritual mentor who, sometimes an older couple or uh, who are just way wiser and just that this have this affinity for helping, other people, trying to better understand and better apply the gospel to their lives. And they, feel a really strong, deep connection to the people who are teaching them, further on the gospel path. And it's situations like that that would make the most sense. If the church still had adoption today, it's those kinds of situations where you have that natural inclination, that connection, and that natural, they're like a father to you in the gospel. Those are the situations that make the most sense for it, rather than somebody trying to like electioneer was the term that was used in winter
Yes.
quarters. People who were electioneering to try to build up a kingdom unto themselves. And Brigham said, it's one thing Brigham said was that it was so foolish because when we get back to the celestial kingdom, he said, I want to pull up this quote so I don't botch it real quickly, but he mentions over and over again that the goal of it was to make the saints be one family rather than, yeah. And they said if this was going to be a divisive thing where it was going to create competition and create division among the people, that would bring great sorrow to them. Like it was not intended to be utilized that way. And so this is the quote. Let's see. Um, uh, Let me see if I can pull this up really quickly. Um, mm, Apologies that I didn't have this one
No, you're
handy.
good. You're good.
I
You're good.
should.
Take your time. I can edit. It's all good.
Yep, yep. Um, okay, here we go. Found it. That didn't take too long. So this was on February 10th, 1867. Journal of Discourses, Volume 11, page 326. He said, quote, "Will the time ever come that we will commence and organize this people as a family? It will. Do we know how? Yes. What was lacking in these revelations from Joseph to enable us to do so was revealed to me. Do you think that we will ever be one? When we get home to our Father and God, will we not wish to be in the family? Will it not be our highest ambition and desire to be reckoned as the sons of the living God, as the daughters of the Almighty, with a right to the household and the faith that belongs to the household, heirs of the Father, his goods, his wealth, his power, his excellency, his knowledge and wisdom? Ought it not to be our highest ambition to attain to this? How many families do you think there will be then?" So the answer is one. There's only one celestial family. Like it's not this divisive thing in the celestial kingdom. They are all united in as one family. And so that's what they really emphasize over and over again, was that this was about the saints becoming one family. And that I think is what really kind of helped them on the trek west when you had so much poverty, you had so much hardship. As you also had saints who, you had the widows, you had the women who had their husbands leave for the Mormon battalion who needed to be taken care of. And so their goal was to use this as a mechanism, not just to provide eternal salvation and exaltation, because that's one of the things that's commonly taught, that we were talking about, is that this was something that pertained to the celestial blessings, the order of the celestial kingdom. But it was also about, kind of temporally uniting the saints. I think when we look at these principles of the fullness of the gospel, we look at like consecration, plural marriage, and even adoption. I think the goal of it is to try to unite the people rather than divide them. I mean, like with plural marriage, the idea is that every woman righteous woman deserves to have a righteous husband, right? She should not have to settle for an unrighteous spouse or to be single in the celestial kingdom. She has the rights. And in a similar way with the law of adoption, you even if your parents were not good parents, you have a right to have good parents in the celestial kingdom. You have a right to have that family, those family relationships in the gospel. And so when I look at, the words of Jesus in the New Testament, where he said, and he looked around on them who sat about him and said, "Behold, my mother and my brethren, for whosoever shall do the will of God, the same is my brother and my sister and my mother." I think that Jesus was really trying to emphasize that we are gaining a much bigger family in the fullness of the gospel. And that might sound weird to some, but when you take the gospel as serious as, there's the word fanatic that's kind of used as kind of a derogatory word. Joseph Musser, I believe in one of his writings, said that he's been fanatically religious in his quest and zeal for perpetuating the fullness of the gospel. But I think that word isn't necessarily a bad thing if it just means that you are being super committed to, it means that you believe in something enough to put it into practice, that you are willing to, have a strong zeal for the fullness of the gospel. It might make you look weird to other people, but I think that when we take the gospel, there are no part-time gods in eternity. You're not going to become a god by going to church once a week and maybe thinking about God for a couple of hours on Sunday. It's about how you live your life and how, you transform your life through the knowledge and the ordinances of the gospel to be more of a celestial person is what's really going to help you attain to godhood. And so I don't view I'm not embarrassed at all for people who want to think that I'm a weirdo for caring so much about what the prophets and the scriptures and the revelations teach. So
Absolutely. And what you said about um just going on Sundays isn't enough. That was one of the things that really appealed to me to Mormonism, right? Um I didn't see where showing up to church and look, I'm not trying to knock anybody or their religion, but I wasn't a fan of Sunday religion, right? I want to know more about what you're doing the other 6 days of the week. It's really easy to be a good guy for 3 hours at your local LDS ward, right? Or a couple hours as a fundamentalist. But what are you doing with the rest of your time, right? Where's the other 6 days devoted to? And so, yeah, I like what you said there. There's no part-time gods in the celestial kingdom.
yeah. And so there's a quote I really like by Benjamin F. Johnson about what Joseph Smith taught him about the sealing principles. That is from his uh, it's from his letter to George F. Gibbs in 1903. So it's a bit late, but he's recalling great a lot of great history in this letter. He said, quote, "The first commandment was to multiply, and the prophet taught us that dominion and power in the great future would be commensurate with the number of wives, children, and friends that we inherit here, and that our mission to this earth was to organize a nuclei of heaven to take with us, to the increase of which there would be no end." And so the part I want to emphasize is the making a nuclei of heaven here on earth to take with you into the next life is the real purpose of the sealing principles. And so one of the things that they really emphasized over and over again was that we are trying to establish heaven on earth is what these principles were about. Brigham Young said, quote, "The only heaven for you is that which you make yourselves. My heaven is here. I carry it with me. When do I expect in its perfection? When I come up in the resurrection, then I shall have it, and not till then." But they still emphasize, that that it's about making heaven for yourselves. And they kind of said that if a person is not really qualified for the celestial kingdom, it would be actually worse. There's a statement by Brigham saying it would be worse than hell to go into the presence of the
Hmm.
Father and Son without being sanctified and prepared for that celestial glory. And so the real emphasis with one of the real emphasis with the idea of building Zion is that we are striving to create heaven on earth in our relationships and how we live with other people. And I think that the interview you did with Isaac Musser was just amazing about the sealing covenant and applying the different laws and the endowment in our family relations to create, celestial family union in our families. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Shout
I
out to
absolutely.
Isaac Musser, man. I've told everybody, you got a young you got a young kid who's about to get married. The best thing you can do is just edit my voice out of that thing and just let Isaac talk to him for a couple hours, because man, there was some serious wisdom imparted in that episode from Isaac.
Yeah, yeah. I think that, if anyone hasn't listened to that, um, I think it's a great one to listen to. And so the real idea with trying to establish heaven on earth is that, and obviously we're not going to be perfect at it, but it's about where we are working towards.
Yep.
And so with the sealing principles, the real understanding or original doctrine of the sealing principles was that it's not about in the LDS Church today, you hear a lot of it's all going to be worked out in the next life. If there's a problem with like, if there's family dynamics that are bad and you're like, I don't really feel like the sealing lineage or something's off here, they'll just say, oh, don't worry about it, it'll all be worked out in the next life. But what the early brethren understood about the sealing principles was we need to start to try to work these things out in this life and figure out, our relationships, developing celestial relationships here in this life, in order to qualify or prepare for those relationships in a higher state of perfection, in the next probation, if it's in the millennium, we're going to come up, and if we aren't really prepared for that, we're not going to, um the wicked, the people who don't qualify, aren't going to be part of that school of, that the millennium will offer. So, um
Absolutely. To go back to what you quoted there from Brigham about, creating the nuclei to take with us, so to speak. Or I guess that was Benjamin F. Johnson, excuse me, quoting Joseph Smith. Um, but Brigham alludes to, working things out so you can have heaven on earth now, right? Now, it won't be a perfected state, but that was another thing that really inspired me as I studied some of the older stuff from some of the brethren, because I remember happening upon that quote. And the idea that you don't have to wait until you're dead to enjoy these blessings, I think is a huge thing, right? And it's something that I don't think Mormons of any stripe, whether that's fundamentalist or LDS or whatever, we don't focus enough on, is that this is the time to perfect those things, right? We do the hard work here. We can have a sample of that here, and when we get on the other side, we're all the better for it.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I actually just found the Brigham Young quote that I was thinking of a few minutes ago about, those who aren't
Sure.
righteous, going to the celestial kingdom, and it would be worse than being in hell for them. So this is Journal of Discourses, Volume 3, page 221, for those wanting to look up. So he said, some might suppose that it would be a great blessing to be taken and carried directly into heaven and there set down. But in reality, that would be no blessing to such persons. They could not reap a full reward, could not enjoy the glory of the kingdom, and could not comprehend and abide the light thereof. But it would be to them a hell intolerable. I suppose would consume them much quicker than would hellfire. It would be no blessing to you to be carried into the celestial kingdom and obliged to stay therein unless you were prepared to dwell therein. And so when we talk about, adoption, that's kind of a piece of the puzzle. And plural marriage is another piece of the puzzle where it's enabling women to all be linked to a righteous husband in this family line. Um, and one of the, I guess another doctrine that was kind of associated with this was that, you grow through having a larger family, that it actually prepares you more fully to God for godhood by having that greater responsibility and having to have that greater care that comes with having a larger family kingdom. There's a Brigham Young quote that I love where he kind of says, "If I was not disposed in my poverty to enlarge my family and build up the kingdom, I would not be acquainted with the difficulties thereof, and I would not be so he would not be prepared more that, if he shrunk from having those trials and those circumstances, and so it's really about really trying to all these principles. When you put all the temple principles together, it's about refining our character, and they need to have actual um they need to have effects in our lives. That's what we're really working for. It's not so much, and you talked with Justin about this, it's not so much the outward ordinance in and of itself, but it's how does this change us inward, and are we really being changed through these experiences and living these principles. And so I really think that, when we're talking about, adoption, I think it's about the saints being one giant family tree, and it's about enlarging our capacity to love others and to serve others is what ultimately this is leading to. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I look back at my time when I joined the LDS Church, and there was a gentleman there who was extremely influential on me, right? Was there for all of the things that I did in the LDS Church. And you'd spoke about those things growing naturally. Those things absolutely grow naturally. And if correct me if I'm wrong here, it was the electioneering that essentially kind of prompted, I believe it was Woodruff to kind of rescind that practice, right?
so actually, I kind of think that you go back to Brother Brigham in 1847, 1848. That's kind of where you have peak adoption being a social institution among the saints, where that is one of the core principles in winter quarters. They're having family meetings regularly. They're doing sacrament as families. They said, and one researcher said that John Taylor's adopted family were like, even when he was away on a mission to England, they were still meeting together in a family capacity and working together.
Mm.
And so there was a lot of good that happened on the trek west with adoption. I can't emphasize that enough, that I think that it was a very important thing. But Brigham also started to see some of the problems that people could have with kind of misusing or misunderstanding um, this principle. And so this was in a family meeting on adoption where he said this on February 16th, 1847. He said, "Were I to say to the elders, you now have the liberty to build up your kingdoms, one half of them would lie, swear, steal, and fight like the very devil to get men and women sealed to them. They would even try to pass by me and go to Joseph, thinking to get between him and the 12. And he says, and if such jealousies and infightings don't stop, then we will, I will just halt all of this. I will say, everyone, everyone just be adopted to me, and I'll be adopted to my father, and him and this whole church will be sealed to Joseph." It's kind of, so he's basically saying that if the infighting and jealousies and abuses of it don't stop, that he would, potentially tell them that we're not going to be practicing it. So even going back to Brigham, there was concerns about it
Mm.
being abused. And so in winter quarters, you had a lot of good from it. They, when I was talking about the temporal blessings, they organized family farms where they adopted families kind of had cooperatives where they worked together, industrially, and helped provide for the temporal needs of the saints, and providing enough food for them as they were in winter quarters. And so I think it was a very, temporally beneficial thing. But there were some problems. Like Brigham had John D. Lee as an adopted son who was kind of in charge of, he was the second adopted son to Brigham. Brigham's first adopted son, A.P. Rockwood, Brigham kind of said, he's going to be the one kind of acting for me while I'm gone, while he's leading pioneer companies to Utah while they're still got most of the adopted family in winter quarters. And John D. Lee was kind of the second in charge, where he was the second adopted son. And so he was given a major role in Brigham's adopted family's farm. And there were concerns that he was not being equitable or being fair in the way that he was temporally dealing with other people. And I haven't really looked at the nitty gritty details of everything that was going on, but I just know that there were a lot of adopted sons of John D. Lee and others who kind of felt that people weren't being treated fairly in the division of land that was going
Mm,
on for these farming pursuits that were going on. And George Lobb kind of felt like that Lee had kind of he was sealed to John D. Lee in the Nauvoo Temple and was entering into that with full faith, and he felt that Lee was kind of using him, like working, having him work for him a ton and not really giving him his fair share, if that makes sense.
gotcha.
And so there were concerns with Lee in other ways, where there was concerns about the way he was treating some of his wives and the way he kind of talked about his family. And it kind of all culminated when Brigham and the apostles got back from. So they go to select a site for the saints to gather in Utah and Salt Lake Valley in July of 1847. And while there, Heber C. Kimball kind of made a comment. He said, if it's advised for us to continue to operate in a family capacity, we should do that. But if we're advised to work in a church capacity, we should be equally willing to do that. And that's kind of what he told his adopted sons when they arrived in Utah. So maybe there was kind of already some, concerns about the logistics of how they were going to continue things. But anyhow, they get back to winter quarters in December or November of 1847. And while there, they kind of learned about some of the conflict that had happened, and some of these infighting and abuses and kind of jealousies and that were starting to grow from it. And basically, kind of Brigham had to kind of put John D. Lee in his place, and not in a mean spirited way, but in a humbling him kind of way, where he said, you need to have your dominion needs to flow to you naturally. Like I would say to anyone who's sealed to me, my wives, my adopted children, that if you don't feel inclined to continue in this relationship, I can't force you to be in this relationship. If you want to be free, you are totally, you have your liberty, And so Brigham was emphasizing what I believe, D&C 121 talks about,
Where my mind went.
where your dominion flows to you without compulsory means, where people associate with you because they love you and they respect you, not because they are being forced to be in that relationship. Like what that isn't a celestial relationship. If
No.
somebody's feeling like they're coerced or manipulated or pressured into a relationship, to maintaining a relationship that's gone sour, obviously relationships take work, but the goal there is, what, so many of us emphasize D&C 121 about, no power or influence ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, that we need to maintain it by meekness, virtue, and teaching. Shame on me for not having that verse as memorized as I should, but those verses in D&C 121 ought to be memorized by us if they don't, and that's probably something that I would do well to memorize. But so Brigham kind of basically tells him, John D. Lee, that you should say to your family that acknowledge that you've made mistakes, acknowledge that there have been screw ups, and say those who want to be free can be free, and those who um, choose to stick with you, let's move forward with in good faith together, and not reflect, not keep, sour feelings, like
Mm-hmm.
you can't stick in a relationship and agree to stick in it, but just keep holding something against the person you're in a relationship with, like not being willing to, having an attitude that's unforgiving, right? You need to be willing to, that's the only way that's a fundamental principle of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we need to forgive our brother. And how much, 70 times 7, as Jesus said, and how much more so does that apply in a family capacity, in your family relationships, right? You need to be striving to work those things out. But so there was issues with John D. Lee that came up. There were issues with some other adopted children who kind of felt like, oh, we can get away with committing iniquity because we're sealed to so and so, like, and they had to. They really did not like that attitude. And Heber C. Kimball kind of said, "I heard it. I recall a story in the Bible about a man who screened iniquity in his family, and he lost the blessings that God gave him because he was willing to cover up the iniquity of his sons, referencing the story of Eli. um and so he says, I won't screen I won't screen iniquity with my adopted sons. I can't even do it with my own biological sons. Like, I have to be righteous and encourage righteousness in my family. And he said, and if I were to take a different course, then I would go to hell with everyone that I justified in their wickedness. And
Right.
so, there were issues there with some people thinking that they could get away with, um, iniquity because of who they were sealed to. And then there were issues of, like Brigham said, these jealousies and people feeling like, oh, I can build up a big kingdom unto myself. And one other person that comes up in Winter Quarters was James Emmett, who kind of was being kind of coercive with the people that were followed and linked with him. And when that came out, Brigham kind of put him in his place as well and said, you're not doing these principles correctly. And so there were a lot of problems with that in Winter Quarters. And so even though Brigham, throughout his discourses, touches on adoption throughout the rest of his life, after 1847, or I believe the last real adoption sermon he gives was in March of 1848, he really kind of puts it more on the back burner. And I don't fault him for that. I think that you got to be, I think he was being a wise steward with what doctrines he taught to the saints and what knowledge he gave to the saints. And, he kind of at one point kind of reflected on Adam God and said, even though I have been fairly, he basically in the school of the prophets at one point said, if I have one regret, it may about doctrine, he says, I don't believe, he says, the truth of Adam God, I've never doubted. Like, that is something he knew was a true revelation, a true knowledge that had been revealed to him and had been revealed to Joseph from heaven. He said, if I had one regret, it was being too public about it before the Gentiles, is what he said. He said, maybe it wouldn't have been good to create stumbling, because it could create a stumbling block for people, if people don't understand it in its proper, it's been used as a tool to ridicule the restored gospel, because they'll throw it out, oh, Brigham Young taught Adam as God, and a lot of mainstream members don't know how to deal with that, don't know how to defend it, right? And
Right.
so, I can understand Brigham kind of in retrospect realize, having some concern about, and he still said this was a temple doctrine. He still made sure that Adam God was incorporated in the endowment in very explicit terms, even though it was there from the beginning in implicit terms. That was something that belonged to the saints who had attained to that level of knowledge. But with adoption in kind of a similar way, so yeah, I believe it was about 1860 that Brigham started kind of saying maybe we shouldn't be uh, so public with um, Gentiles about Adam God. In 1862, he actually kind of mentioned and said, explained that uh, he had been kind of silent on adoption for for quite a while. So this was on August 3rd, 1862, Journal of Discourses, Volume 9, page 334. Oh, excuse me. Wrong quote. That's a different quote that mentions adoption. But so I'm thinking April 6, 1862, Volume 9, page 269. So Brigham said, quote, I will here refer to a principle that has not been named by me for years. With the introduction of the priesthood upon the earth was also introduced the sealing ordinance, that the chain of the priesthood from Adam to the latest generation might be united in one unbroken continuance. It is the same power and the same keys that Elijah held and was to exercise in the last days. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. By this power, men will be sealed to men back to Adam, completing and making perfect the chain of the priesthood from his day to the winding up scene. I have known men that I positively think would fellowship the devil if he would agree to be sealed to them. Oh, be sealed to me, brother. I care not what you do. You may lie and steal or anything else. I can put up with all your meanness. If only you will be sealed to me. Now, this is not so much weakness as it is selfishness. And I would say there, in some cases, men might be weak where they might, not feel like, calling people to repentance because of, feeling kind of timid in their character about doing such things. But I can see what he's saying here about the selfishness where it's like, I want you sealed to me. I don't care what you do, as long as you're kind of adding part of my kingdom kind of attitude.
Right.
And you definitely see that in winter quarters. So Brigham continues. He says about adoption, he says, quote, "It is a great and glorious doctrine, but the reason I have not preached in the midst of this people is I could not do it without turning so many of them to the devil. Some would go to hell for the sake of getting the devil sealed to them. I've had visions and revelations instructing me how to organize this people so that they can live like the family of heaven. But I can't do it while so much selfishness and wickedness reign in the elders of Israel. Many would make of the greatest blessings a curse to them, as they do now the plurality of wives. The abuse of that principle will send thousands to hell. There are many great and glorious privileges for the people, which they are not prepared to receive. How long it will be before they are prepared to enjoy the blessings God has in store for them, I know not. It has not been revealed to me. I know the Lord wants to pour blessings upon this people, but were he to do so in their present ignorance, they would not know what to do with them. They can receive only a very little, and that must be administered to them with great care."
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's a
Whew.
quote.
Yeah, that is a big quote, right? And now we have to start asking the question, right? Because I do think that the seasons have changed a little bit here for us as fundamentalists. Um, are we going to be those people that can handle it? Right? I think that's a huge question that needs to be asked. Um, Certainly, I just like I'd say for plural marriage, right? That I don't think everyone will live it in this life. I would hope that everyone gets okay with the doctrine, but I think it might be the same with this kind of sealing too, right? Um, but let's not forget that it seems like it's pretty important to have that chain welded back to Adam, right? What did the Lord say would happen to the earth if that didn't happen? It's utterly wasted,
Yeah.
right? And so it's proving to be a major doctrine that deserves attention. And it needs to be understood correctly. And that's what I'm getting out a little bit out of this conversation too, is that the saints weren't in those days weren't it wasn't for lack of zeal that they were getting into trouble. It was a lack of understanding of the principles, right? And selfishness and those sorts of things, which again I think you can put back on lack of understanding. And I think it becomes incumbent upon us to really make sure that we're understanding those things.
Amen. And for me, it's almost a humbling thing to hear. We often put the pioneers on a pedestal about, oh, they had everything, you know, figured out, back then. That they were, you know, everyone back then was on track for the celestial kingdom, and it's us who backslidden. But if you hear what Brigham's saying, there were a lot of people who were backslidden in his day. And so he's saying about the saints in his day, he said, you know, they can receive only a very little, and that must be administered to them with great care. And so that kind of shows you that so even if the people are, if a lot of the people aren't fully ready for the celestial principles, that does not mean that those can't be taught among those who are, and Brigham, the big thing, some people kind of take an attitude of this. I've heard some people take an apologetic attitude towards mainstream LDS church leaders today, where it's, oh, the people aren't ready for it. It's a mercy for the people to not have them teaching the higher principles to them, right? Is kind of Well, I've heard that apologetic used before, and if we the church members would just rise up, then our leaders would be able to teach us the principles, and I bless their hearts. I don't want to discourage anyone from rising up and trying to be, to raise the bar, in their conduct and their striving for the gospel. But Brigham had backslidden members in his day. Lots of, in that statement, it makes it sound like I would think it's safe to assume he's talking about the majority of the people not being quite prepared for the higher principles. But what is he doing? He is trying to lift them up
Right.
to those principles, and he wants to help them. And that's what a good leader would do, is not try to be, oh, I'm going to leave the people in ignorance because they're not worthy of these principles. He's saying, these principles are here for those who qualify for them, and let's try to get you on the path to qualify for these higher principles. And so that's what I respect about the early pioneer leaders, is that, even if the church was starting to regress in some ways after Joseph's death, that Brigham and the other leaders were, the other faithful apostles were trying to keep the people going. And you kind of see that in the 1880s with plural
Hmm.
marriage, and we're a lot of recent discussions about the 1886 revelation, is most of the members were starting to backslide. The pressure was too great. They were not wanting to be faithful to the principles, the plural marriage, in the face of severe persecution, prosecution, disenfranchisement. They were, a lot of members were struggling with being faithful, but the righteous leaders were trying to help them push along. We're trying to encourage them. And the Lord was giving revelations to encourage them to be faithful no matter what they are facing. And so that's what a good leader does, is they try to stretch the people and make them better, not trying to let them get comfy, or try make their garments be a little bit more comfortable for the styles of the world, kind of,
Right.
to use an analogy there of, recent another kind of recent news story. And
Right.
so I would say that Brigham never, if I look through his discourses, I've tried to have, compile a lot of material on adoption, because this is, I consider, an important aspect of the sealing doctrines. Brigham does make references to it in passing through a lot of discourses, and when people ask about it, he's willing to tell them about it. And so one good quote about this is on February 17th, 1857, in a letter to a brother of the church, kind of asking about adoption. Brigham wrote this. He said, quote, so this is 1857, so, probably 5 years before that quote we just read. He said, the doctrine of adoption, the patriarchal order, has not been taught of late, but will be attended to in its season as soon as we have another temple built to the Most High. You belong to the kingdom of God, but may make your own choice to whom you will be adopted, and when you have made this choice, you may report it, that may be put on record, and in the event of death, because of this record, the adoption would be attended to for the dead in the proper time and place. This is for the purpose of having an unbroken chain of priesthood from the present time back through Joseph to the apostles, to the Jews, to Jesus, even back to Adam. So he kind of references it and isn't shy of explaining it to him. There's another sermon he gave, kind of, there's a rare sermon in the mid 1850s on January 13th, 1856, where he kind of preached on the importance of this. And this kind of debunks some, there's certain apologetic arguments about adoption where it's like, oh, it was just like parent-child stealing, it's kind of, they try to minimize it and say, oh, it's just parent-child stealing. They're just trying to figure it out. Um, read this, I'll read this quote and then you tell me if this sounds like it's just a simple parent-child stealing. He said, let's see. This isn't in the Journal of Discourses. This is in Complete Discourses of Brigham Young. So he said, we will administer in the temple. This we have now begun, and that is one point gained, and we will, let's see. He said, the priesthood will turn the hearts of the children to the ancient fathers, and the children to the fathers now, and those which are to come will be made perfect. This chain must not be broken, for mankind can't be saved any other way. This priesthood must be linked together so that all the children may be linked to Father Adam. It may be asked when this work will be done. It will be done in temples in our day and in the days of our children. We will administer in the temple, which we have now begun, and that is one point gained, and we will seal men to men by the keys of the holy priesthood. This is the highest ordinance. It is the last ordinance of the kingdom of God on the earth, and above all the endowments that can be given you. It is a final sealing, an eternal principle, and when once made, cannot be broken by the devil.
Hmm.
So,
Whew.
a bit more serious than just having your children sealed to you in the covenant, right? And there's another quote that I wish I had the original source, but Brigham kind of made a comment that when the temple was built, men would be sealed to men in a more solemn ordinance and in a higher room than the ordinance where men had women sealed to them.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of equating this as being more on par with, so when we talk about, the endowment versus the second endowment, this was kind of, if sealing women to men was, kind of in Brigham's mind, kind of on par with, the initial first endowment. He was viewing the law of adoption as being a principle kind of on par with the second endowment, if that makes
It
sense.
should
Like
kind of take place in the Holy of Holies almost.
yeah, that's what at least this one letter seemed to indicate. And that quote where he's talking about this is the highest ordinance and it's above all the endowments that can be given to you. And it's about making an unbroken chain of the priesthood, that the devil cannot break. And so,
Interesting.
yeah, there's so much, you know, the, like I said, there's a lot more to this that should be
Let, let,
um,
let me ask this
dug
question.
into.
Yeah, let me ask this question real quick. When do we see these these kind of law of adoption sealings stop completely?
So, they get the temple, St. George Temple in 1877. And then in the 1880s, they continue to do adoptions. But it seems like, leaders, John Taylor still believed in it. It was still being practiced under him. Um, but then after John Taylor, you start to see some of the leaders say, we don't really understand this as much as we should. I mean, Brigham Young kind of made comments admitting that he even felt like his knowledge was limited and that there could be, he says, I have only a smattering of this, is what he said, but I have the keys where God can give me more knowledge and I can attain to more knowledge to better understand the application of this principle, when the proper time comes for it. And so John Taylor continued to do it into the 1880s. I'm trying to find the quote where it said whole families. There's one statement. Okay, found it. Anti-Mormon account in Mormon Portraits in 1886 says people go there to the Logan Temple to have their children sealed to them. Otherwise, they would not have them in all eternity. And then whole families get sealed to Brother Taylor to make sure of enjoying all the advantages of his exceeding weight of glory. So kind of anti-Mormon account, but
Sure.
mentioning that people were being sealed to John Taylor in the temples. We have Wilford Woodruff's journal during that time period, 1885, said, I had 10, January 30th, 1885 said, I was sealed for 24 couples of dead friends and I had 10 adoptions to me. I sealed one living couple. So kind of, he was really great at making like uh, uh, numerical list account of how much ordinances he would do every day, and he was very very busy with the amount of
Yeah, it was.
ordinances that he was doing. So one thing that before we talk about the end of adoption, one thing that comes up is how do we know this went back to Joseph Smith? Like people will say Brigham Young was teaching this. Sure, how do we know that this went back to Joseph Smith? And I've compiled quite a bit where I think it's pretty evident that it went back to Joseph Smith. And the biggest pieces of evidence that I would say is the first one is that Lyman White, who separated from Brigham and the other apostles in August of 1844, he goes to Zodiac, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and builds a temple there. And they're doing adoptions in sealings in Texas. They're doing eternal marriages and they're doing adoptions and they're doing kind of an abbreviated endowment ordinance there in Texas. And so the fact that I've always said that if Lyman White and Brigham Young are both teaching the same thing, that is evidence to me that they got it from Joseph, because Lyman White was never with Brigham Young after the succession crisis. They were together at the August 8th meeting, and supported the 12, the people uniting behind the 12, and then Lyman went off to Texas, and there never was any sort of ordinance work with Brigham. They were, they kind of became, unfortunately, rivals for a large part,
I
for the
was
rest
gonna
of
say
life.
they were kind of there was some rub going on there, right? I mean, there was some friction happening between those two.
Yeah, in a similar way, I would say that, as a comparison, like the question comes up whether a monogamous sealing can go to the celestial kingdom or not, or if you have to have enter into polygamy to have, to go to the celestial kingdom. And obviously, plural marriage is a higher law to become a god, right? That's 1882 revelation to John Taylor explicitly says is not meet for men to preside over my priesthood who do not abide my law. And John Taylor, after reading that, says we have to abide by the law that our Heavenly Father dwells in. But what both Brigham Young and Lyman White agreed on was that if you're a faithful monogamous, you're sealed faithfully in monogamy, you can go to the celestial kingdom, but that those who are in plural, successfully, righteously in plural marriage will have a greater glory in the celestial kingdom. They will, they're further advanced in the celestial kingdom, is the way to put it. So when I saw that Lyman White and Brigham Young were teaching the same thing in that regard, it was strong evidence to me that what they understood about sealings went back to what Joseph Smith taught.
Right.
So, that's one of the things that I love is when we, comparative study in the Restoration, is that there's truth in different places. I think Brigham and the apostles with him fortunately preserved the most of what Joseph taught, but there were other breakoffs that did preserve pieces. And when they agreed with what Brigham and the 12 taught, then I think that's very compelling evidence that they got it from Joseph Smith.
Absolutely. And it's just a good way of, fulfilling that law of witnesses thing even, right? And look, especially when the two parties don't always agree on things, right? Because there's definitely some friction happening between Brigham Young and Lyman White. And the fact that that we see these two teachings simultaneously in different parts of the country, there's only one common denominator, right? And that's that they were taught by the same guy. And so it's safe to assume that this was coming from Joseph.
Yeah. So there's other pieces of evidence, like there's a statement by not Willard Richards, excuse me, Wilford Woodruff in 1887 about adoption, where he said he's admitting he doesn't really understand it as much as he'd like, but he says that surely it's a true principle, or our prophets have been badly deceived. And he said that we don't understand. He said Paul talked a great deal about adoptions, but we did not understand it until Joseph explained it, and so he's basically
Mm.
indicating that it was Joseph Smith who was the source of, adoption. And similarly, there's statements kind of recalling that even as early as the early 1830s, that Joseph was telling the saints that the Lord had promised him that he would be able to save them, the saints, in his kingdom, Joseph's kingdoms, just as Christ is made a place for Joseph in his kingdom. So you kind of have that precursor to adoption there. And then in Nauvoo, you have people recalling Joseph telling them that, your family is going to be linked to me. That was something that was being taught in the Nauvoo period, or that people remembered, that those conversations occurred. Just one example, John D.T. McAllister in a letter to John Taylor on May 22nd, 1882, talking about the Rollins family and Mary E. Uh, Leitner, So he said, as I understand, you are well acquainted with Brother James A. Rollins and his sister Mary E., who is the plural wife of Joseph the prophet. It does not require a great deal of writing from me because he has had his second anointing and can act for his uncle if approved. So they're talking about proxy ordinances that were being
Right.
done. He said, but they are very much exercised about their mother. He informs me that it was understood when living at President Joseph Smith's that he was to be in his family and would like his mother sealed to him, i.e., Joseph Smith. And so then that was accompanied with a letter by Mary Rollins Lightner and her brother James to John Taylor, which said, he says, um, uh, so she was actually the mother was sealed to somebody else later on, kind of at suggestion, but that they felt that it would be more appropriate to have the mother sealed to Joseph, as that was, um, that they were living in Joseph's home and that there was an understanding that there was to be a family connection there. So he says, I wish to know if the sealing of my mother to Mr. John M. Burke in Nauvoo can be changed. As she did not wish to be sealed to him, but Brother Young told her, let it be for the present, and it can be changed afterwards, or words to that effect. Must her sealing remain, or was it or as it was in Nauvoo? Or can she be sealed to Joseph? For that is our desire. Henry desires to be adopted into Joseph's kingdom. And so then that other letter made it clear that they were understood that from Joseph while living at his home. And so you're asking kind of when adoption kind of starts falling out of the picture. And I really think, 1887, after John Taylor's death is when people start, that there was always kind of people who didn't really understand it, but it was after Brigham Young and John Taylor died that you start to see that the general opinion is we don't really understand what we're doing, kind of is, was kind of the attitude. And so an example of this is John M. Whitaker wrote in his journal on November 16th, 1887, asking church leaders about adoption. Um, he said, let's see, um, he said, uh, he says, this is being discussed. Much is being discussed that no one seems to know practically anything about. I especially make note of the idea here to show the spirit of the times that many people get infused with new ideas and rush into things sometimes without knowing much about the seriousness of the matter involved. Even among members of the 12 apostles, there seems to be little known about the law of adoption at this particular time that I can find out about. President George Buchanan said he did not understand the matter. So he's a church historian, and he's kind of saying that that they don't really understand it as well as they could. And similarly, there's a letter by Wilford Woodruff, who's acting president after 1887, which is a very significant letter where he's kind of talking about the endowment. And he says, if I have anything to say about the endowment, follow the pattern that President Young laid out, because he was with Joseph from the beginning to the end of the endowments in Nauvoo.
Right.
And, if anyone understood it, Brigham Young did. So then after kind of talking about that he talks about adoption in this letter. And so he says, quote, in relation to adoptions, most, if not all, of the presidency and 12 have men adopted to them. And in all these sealings and adoptions, and all these sealings and adoptions are for the salvation of the living and the dead. I've never asked any man to be adopted into my family that I can recollect of, but I have had a number of family and friends adopted into my family, as have other men, without any regard as to whether it will in the future cost me $1 or a million. What we have done in this matter has been for the salvation of man. And then continuing, he says, Brother Riskel, let's see. He said, there's got to be a welding link of some kind before we get through with this work that will adopt man to man and weld all dispensations from Father Adam down to the last saint. When all this matters, I do not go around electioneering to get men adopted to me. I don't want any of this work done for me, only what the Lord wants. Paul talked a great deal about adoptions, but we did not understand much about it until the Lord revealed it to Joseph Smith, and we may not perhaps understand it now as fully as we should. Still, the sealings and adoptions are true principles, or our prophets have been badly deceived. So
Oh,
that's a pretty key statement there saying, we may not, we don't understand it as much as we'd like, and we probably don't understand it as much as we should, but still, this is a true principle, or our prophets have been badly deceived. So, very clear statement saying that this was had to be a true principle, and that's one of the things that made me realize that this something was, um, something was seriously off with what happened after 1894 was when they officially ended adoption to the present. Was either the first 50 years of temple ordinances were being done correctly and according to the pattern, or are we going to say that the first 50 years were church leaders screwing up and not really knowing what
Right.
was going on, and that everything after 1894, when they stopped practicing adoption, was is the true method? And so that was the thing that made me kind of go, I kind of lean towards spring water is tastes better closer to the fountain. And I feel like I'm better off trusting the people who are closer to the fountain, who are closer to what Joseph taught, than people who come down the road and, you know, basically in some ways they kind of admit that that they don't really understand things as much as they did before. I mean, like in some ways they kind of say, we don't really understand why we're doing it this way, but this way is the way we're feeling like doing things now. And that's when the doctrine of sealing became, oh, it'll all be worked out on the other side. We don't have to really think about or worry about it. And so I want to touch on work for the dead, because this is a very important aspect of the restoration. And, if we are, Joseph said baptism for the dead was one of the most important principles. There's unequivocal terms where he's talking about this being, that work for the dead being one of the most important things, that we could do in this dispensation, talking about the temple doctrines,
Yeah.
and it's connected.
But before we go on to that, I do have a question here. So Wilford, just what the history tells us, right? The manifesto was not the end of plural marriage in Utah, right? We have Wilford Woodruff essentially being like, yeah, we stopped, wink, wink, nod, nod, right? Does is there any evidence to suggest that after Wilford says, yeah, we're not doing this anymore, that they continue to do it, kind of like they did with plural marriage?
Um, and not exactly. So, in a similar way, so I understand with plural marriage, like the manifesto was intended to be a lie to the government. It was not really intended to be a revelation doing away with plural marriage. It was not even really considered a revelation initially. It was
Mm-mm.
considered a document that Wilford felt inspired. It was considered inspired advice to the saints for the salvation of the church. That's how they initially framed it, and then it grew over. The lie
Yeah.
grew over time, unfortunately, and that's the problem with lies, is that they often outlive the people telling them. And
Yep.
so, but after the majority of a lot of those leaders who were involved with issuing that lie, after they passed on, then the next generation, enforced it with a vengeance,
Yep.
took it as so what's interesting with the manifesto, because um there's kind of discussion about maybe Woodruff have felt really been inspired of God to issue the manifesto, because the church was in a really hard place, and we at least sympathize with the hard place he was in, that we don't want to throw stones at Woodruff for being in a very extremely between a rock and a hard place, extremely difficult situation. But at the very best, I see the manifesto as they ask the Lord over and over and over again if the Lord would be okay with them suspending plural marriage, right, for the salvation of the church. That's the 1886 Revelations context. My son John, you've asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant. How far is it binding on my people? The 1889 revelation to Wilford
Right.
Woodruff. was about asking about issuing a manifesto. And the Lord, in very, thus saith the Lord, said, make no further pledges of my priesthood.
Right.
Your enemies seek the destruction of this people. And so that's, at the very best, you can look at the manifesto as Martin Harrison, the 116 pages where they asked the Lord repeatedly. Finally, the Lord gave in and let them do it, but that doesn't mean that's what the Lord wanted, right?
Or that there
That's
wouldn't
how,
be repercussions.
yeah, yeah. And so that's a most charitable way of looking at the manifesto. Um, I personally lean against that interpretation where I think that the Lord didn't want the manifesto to be issued,
Hmm.
just simply because 1889 Revelation seems to be very direct. Like I don't think the Lord changes his mind like that, where he says, "Don't do this. I can't do this. I won't revoke this law," and then they go ahead and do it anyway. Um, and Woodruff didn't really consider a revelation at the time. He considered it, and I felt, I was given this vision of the destruction that would befall us, and I felt impressed to write this. That's not really God giving a "Thus saith the Lord"
Right.
revelation to do it. Um, and then the other thing is that in 1888, on December 20th, 1888, there was a meeting of the apostles to discuss issuing a manifesto then. So this was like year after year, they are discussing this in the 1880s. This is not a one time or two times. There's repeated discussions about political, issuing a political concession to try to save the church. And so in this meeting, the apostles unanimously rejected this document that their political friends had, Woodruff said, wanted them to consider. And so Woodruff said this after saying he was overjoyed at the opinion of the brethren in rejecting it. He said, quote, "The Lord will never give a revelation for us to abandon plural marriage. And if we had accepted this document, we should have found ourselves under condemnation. Our enemies are laboring for our destruction. If we were to abandon this principle, we will be required to give up other principles." And
Interesting.
so that's the thing that's
Ooh.
in the 1890s looking at is what were the fruits of the manifesto? And I would say there aren't a whole lot of good fruits with, having to say one thing publicly, do another thing privately. And it almost was creating like where the blessings of plural marriage were only given to those who had insider access, right? Under
Right.
those conditions, where you had to know somebody, you had to know an apostle, you had to know a leader in order to get kind of snuck in and still be getting those blessings. But when I look at the 1890s, they are principle after principle starts going away with the manifest after the manifesto. It seems like you do the big hurdle of caving to the government, then for over what they were considering was like the litmus test, like battle, that the principle they were battling over. Then it became so easy to give up, anything else that became an inconvenience or um, a difficulty. And adoption, as we were discussing, there was difficulties with it. You have people trying to use it to divide the saints or to grandize themselves, to build up their own independent kingdom, and would be who would abuse that principle. And so it seems almost convenient that you could do away with it. I mean, you know, one thing that was kind of surprising to me was that I mean not Woodruff, Cannon, uh, they issued the manifesto. Um, I think they issue it first in September. That's presented at conference in October of 1890. In October, Cannon breaks his adoption covenant with his uncle John Taylor, the third president of the church, and has himself sealed to his own biological father instead of to John Taylor. Right after the manifesto, I was kind of surprised when I saw that in Cannon's journal. His father had rejected the gospel. Um, he chose to be adopted to his uncle in the Nauvoo temple because his uncle had chosen, to accept the gospel and be faithful, while his father didn't. And so for him to break his adoption covenant was a very sad thing for me to see, because what's interesting is he defends adoption in some of his journal entries. He's cautious about it, but he still defends it. And so one interesting thing place where he defends it, is in the diaries of Abraham Cannon, his son, where on December 18th, 1890, Joseph F. Smith is the first person that says, we should not be adopted to other people. We should just seal our family lines back as far as we can and seal the last one to Joseph. He says that in 1890. And George Buchanan, in response, defends adoption, which is kind of, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around it, because he broke his adoption covenants, 2 months earlier. So this is what Abraham Cannon wrote. He said, quote, "Father holds that we who live on the earth now and are faithful will stand at the head of our lineage and will thus become saviors, as has been promised us. President John Taylor was not sealed to his parents, though they died in the church, as he felt it was rather lowering himself to be sealed when he was an apostle and his father was a high priest. But this is a rather questionable proceeding." But then in George Buchanan's journal for that day, he said, "I made some appropriate remarks on adoption, and President Woodruff backed me up in what I said," is what he wrote in his journal about that discussion. And so what that kind of mentions there is about work for the dead, is that you have them linked to you because you are their savior on Mount Zion performing those
Mm-hmm.
ordinances. And you are further along the gospel path, and you don't even know if they're going to accept those ordinances, let alone live faithful and qualify for those blessings. So they are, doing the work for them. Isn't Some people look at ordinance work as like a check mark, like
Right.
I've got my ordinances, I'm good. But in reality, the ordinances are putting you on a path. And
Yep.
that's same with the dead. When you're doing ordinances for the dead, you are putting them on the path, and it's going to be a very laborious work to teach them even beyond the veil, to for them to um, you know, progress in the gospel, and really, it's in mortality where you face the really hard test. If we could all just figure it out on in the spirit world, then we wouldn't really need to um
Right. What's the
come
point of
here.
this go round?
Yeah, to come here in mortality. And the point is to face the opposition and see if you will, improve and um, be faithful even in spite of all the difficulties and that separation from God, that we are willing to still be faithful when we, are kind of, at times feel alone, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I don't want to add anything. I do have a question though. So, do you get a sense on why Cannon canceled his sealing? Was it just because, Woodruff said, "Hey, we should be sealed to our own our own parents," sort of a thing, or I'm trying to wrap my mind around it, right? Because you do have guys who are polygamists, especially up top, who, when the manifesto comes down, they still take care of their wives and children, right? Some I know that some members did leave their other families. Um, Not what I would do, but whatever. Um, do we have any indication on what causes Cannon to do this? Is he just trying to be obedient to Wilford?
So one thing that comes up in the 1880s in Cannon's journal specifically is John Taylor apparently makes some sort of comments about how he feels like he needs to have himself directly linked to Joseph Smith in adoption. And Cannon's kind of, and this is probably why Abraham Cannon wrote that his father considered it a questionable affair. Cannon thinks that because John Taylor had faithful parents in the church, he should be linked to those parents and then linked to Joseph Smith. That's what Brigham Young kind of talked about his stealing line,
Okay.
that because his father was a faithful member of the church, and Erastus Snow had a faithful father in the church. And so, if your father was a faithful member of the church, then it would make sense to link yourself to them and then, link them back into the chain. And so John Taylor, however, I think felt like, yeah, he needed a closer connection with Joseph Smith, is what I kind of got from those entries. And Cannon was kind of uncomfortable with that. And he said he was also uncomfortable with electioneering that kind of had happened in the in the winter quarters period. And I do think that I think a lot of people can accept adoption intellectually, but when it comes to like a person, a lot of people personally feel strongly to their, and there's no fault in that. And I feel strongly about my connections with my father, who, even if he's not accepted the higher principles, and he's a great man, I still feel that kinship as a son to my father. And so I can understand people having those natural sympathies and feelings towards, their parents, but and I think part of it is people feel like if they're being adopted to someone else, they're throwing away that parental relationship, is kind of what I've heard people feel like that might be the way they look at it. But I don't see it that way at all. In the celestial kingdom, it's a very when we're talking about sealed lines in the celestial kingdom, it's a lot more about a sealed lineages of gods. Like, this
Yep.
is not a parent-child relationship as in like you're a little boy and you're being like uh you know it's not the same kind of relationship.
You're not trading your dad in for another dad, so to speak.
Yeah, he was still your father, the one who raised you, the one who had those experiences with you. And so this, you have the way Work for the Dead worked was, you would have them linked to you, and it's not like, I'm your father now. It's like I'm a father or patriarchal father is the term you used. I am on the path to godhood. I am working towards being a king and priest, or a king and a priest in the celestial order. And I'm going to raise up my father to be a god and a king and a priest. And I'm going to teach him how to be like, what I have learned how to be.
Gotcha.
And so, you're not throwing away your father. And so, um, the way I've this really fascinated me when I first learned about um the dead were sealed to the living, because I'm like, wow, that's kind of an obscure part of adoption that's not really talked about a lot.
Right?
But it's kind of hinted at when you go back to the Nauvoo Temple Revelation, where it says, "Behold, at the end of this appointment, your baptisms for your dead shall not be acceptable unto me. And if you do not these things at the end of the appointment, ye shall be rejected as a church with your dead, saith the Lord your God." And I read that and I was like, why is the dead? So if the living people don't live up to what they're supposed to do, why are the dead, who they do ordinances for, being rejected also? It doesn't really make sense. If they were, if it was a valid ordinance, it's like if you perform a baptism for someone and you apostatize and get rejected by God, that baptism you performed when you were
Right.
righteous, priesthood holder, isn't invalid. It doesn't undo all the ordinances you did if before you fell. And so that didn't make sense to me until I learned about the dead being linked to the living. And then it's like, well, you being rejected with your dead is your dead that are linked to you. So they would have to be linked to someone else if you were rejected because of unfaithfulness, is what that was alluding to. And you start to see that very early on in patriarchal blessings, even before the 12 returned back to Nauvoo. So this is John Smith, Joseph Smith's uncle, in a patriarchal blessing to Alan Stout on July 30th, 1844. He said, in this blessing, it said, quote, "Thou shalt have the privilege of redeeming thy dead and bring them up in the resurrection and reign over them with thy companion and children to all eternity." And so there it's kind of talking about the dead being in your kingdom, in the resurrection. So that's in one patriarchal blessing. Patriarch, there's other patriarchal blessings that mention that. Um, So Brigham Young very explicitly said that, referenced this in a discourse he gave to the 70s on February 10th, 1845, where he said, quote, "According to the order established, all saviors shall stand at the head of those whom they redeem and bring them into their own kingdom and bring them into their own kingdom and reign over them. Consequently, all men must be redeemed by men that are found worthy, and the women are to be redeemed by women acting for and in their behalf. For example, a man and his wife will go into the font. The man will be baptized for all his male relatives, and also the male relatives of his wife, and she will be baptized for all the females that is related to herself or husband, and bring them up into their kingdom and their reign over them." So that was one quote about it. And another quote Brigham said about it said, quote, "Before I stop, I will answer a question that has been repeatedly asked me. Should I have a father who is dead, who has never heard this gospel? Would it be required of me to redeem him and then have him adopted into some man's family and I be adopted to my father?" So kind of what Cannon was ended up doing, right? By being like, oh, I'm going to link myself to my dad and link my dad to, um, you know, what happens later on. So he's referencing that kind of idea in the sermon in February of 1847. Brigham said, quote, "I answer no. If we have to attend to the ordinance of redeeming our dead relatives, we then become their saviors. And were we to wait to redeem our dead relatives before we could link the chains of the priesthood, we would never accomplish it." So he's kind of saying, like, we can't wait for them to accept the gospel for us to progress in the gospel, is what
Mhm.
Brigham is saying. And so I think part of where Cannon might, one of the things that, if I'm being charitable, where he might have went wrong is he's doing the ordinance work for his family and for his father, getting his proxy endowments for him. And he's feeling the spirit strongly that his father is accepting the ordinance. And so therefore he's getting confused and thinking, okay, I can link myself to my father now, is kind of what he was thinking, instead of understanding that as my father's being linked to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, let me see.
So,
Let me see if I can summarize this and make sure I have it right. So rather than seal our, okay, my case, we'll just use my dad as an example. He passed before I became a Mormon. So rather than go in and do my dad's work and then seal him to, I don't know, Joseph Smith as an example, and then me be sealed to my dad, the proper order, based on what we just heard from Brigham, was for me to take my dad's name to the temple, do his work after I've been sealed to a living line, so to speak, right? Joseph or whoever, and then have my dad sealed to me. Is that a good synopsis of that?
yep, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So I'm glad you asked that clarification. And so, like I said, with comparing what other branches of the restoration were teaching, what I thought was interesting was that I see this idea of the dead being linked to the living in other branches of the restoration in the 1840s. So Sidney Rigdon and James Strang both had this idea of baptism for the dead in teaching. I mean, Rigdon obviously was in Nauvoo and he was getting pieces of it. He obviously rejected plural marriage, but he still understood parts of it, and he tried to have, you know, he wanted to have kings and priests. He wanted to have the temple doctrines, just he didn't want all of it.
Right.
Um, and similarly, James Strang was, even though he was not in Nauvoo, he had a lot of people who were in Nauvoo kind of join with him at different times. And so he learned a lot of what was taught in Nauvoo in his experience. And so they both kind of had this idea, and that I thought was very validating to, the idea of multiple witnesses, right, to this doctrine. So this is what Rigdon taught on April 10th, 1845, to his followers. He said, he, Sidney Rigdon, spoke of baptism for the dead, showing it was of no avail unless the persons being baptized for the dead should maintain their integrity and power before God until they obtained the priesthood of the kingdom. And through that, priesthood of the kingdom, talking about kings and priests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through that priesthood, bear off the kingdom triumphant, and through these means present themselves before God triumphant with their dead with them. Unless they did that, they would be cut off and perish, and their dead with them. So kind of talking about people needing to be valiant in the kingdom of God in order to, you know, have those blessings of their dead being linked with them. So,
Right.
so that one I thought,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry, Jacob.
no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, that the way that Brigham describes it, right, that we just laid out here, actually is a second witness. There's another witness to this in kind of a separate but related item, right? I had once read something from Brigham Young, and I haven't been able to find it since. And I know I read this somewhere, but Brigham was basically talking about the resurrection as an ordinance. And he said the sons will call up their fathers, right? And if their father, if you had to do the work for your kindred dead, let's say it was your father that passed on before you, it would be your responsibility and right within that priesthood ordinance to call your father forward at that time. And that kind of seems to hold water here with how Brigham's describing this adoption ordinance, right? Where the living person is sealed into a living line, and then he has his kindred dead sealed to him.
Yep. Yep. And some people, and this is where it makes sense, where you can continue to offer salvation to your family. You can continue to reach out to them and continue to offer them chances to progress in the fullness of the gospel because you have been faithful in the kingdom of God and have attained to that power and those blessings. And so it's, it isn't, you aren't losing your family by entering into the
Right.
adoption, but in fact, you're gaining more power to link them to yourself and to offer salvation to them. To me, it's a very beautiful doctrine. It makes a lot more sense than say, I'm sealed. If my father's father was an unrighteous man and was not worthy of his wife, was not worthy of his family, to think that, yeah, he's going to be the one that we're linked to in the celestial kingdom. That doesn't hold a lot of water. But if we're linking him to us and we're giving him an opportunity to repent and progress, that makes a
Yeah.
lot more sense to me and personally when understanding the temple doctrines.
Yeah.
So I was just wanting to mention the James Strain quote, just because we don't just have two witnesses, but this will give us a third witness of it besides
Nice.
Brigham. So in Strang's Book of the Law of the Lord, he put in instructions on temples, he said, quote, "But no man or woman among you shall be baptized for the dead, who is not a member of some family according to the order of the church of the firstborn of God, or who is under condemnation of any word of this law, or withholding anything whatsoever from the treasury of the house of the Lord your God." So he kind of mentions that you shouldn't do baptism for the dead if you're not a member of a family according to the order of the church of the firstborn. And so, church of the firstborn is kind of a term that they use in
Hmm.
Nauvoo to reference these higher temple organizations. So the note to this, and I don't know if it was Strang's, I think it was Strang's personal note, but I'm not entirely sure. But the note to this was, quote, "Those who are not regular members of any family duly organized have no place to bring those for whom they shall be baptized. They have no home for them to abide in everlasting life. The chief thing in the salvation promised in the gospel is in the family relation and love of a holy people. Those who lack that relationship are unsaved themselves and unprepared to save others." So he's saying the ultimate salvation in the kingdom of God is in the family relation and to be, in the family of the people of God. And so that's why he's saying that's a prerequisite for baptism for the dead. So you can bring them into the family. So, I think that is another compelling, you know, witness in another branch of the restoration of this doctrine. So, and then another quote just to show how early adoption it was being taught in connection with work for the dead. William Clayton has a journal entry for October 1st, 1844, meeting of the Anointed Quorum in Nauvoo, where he noted, quote, "A man has a right to be baptized for his acquaintances who are not relatives and sealed to them only by the consent and authority of him who holds the keys. So kind of saying that there's this regulation going on with work for the dead where they don't want people to go too crazy with it. There's concerns about people trying to just link whoever to themselves, and so you have the doctrine was that you have a right to do the work for your relatives, for your ancestors and their families. That was what Joseph taught. For work for anyone else outside of your family, it requires kind of a special permission. Otherwise, you could get kind of funky things with people trying to,
Right.
seal like deceased famous people to themselves or whatever, kind of those kinds of things. And you do kind of in early Utah see some of that a little bit where they were like sealing like queens of England to Joseph Smith as wives. And you're like, do you think that's really what Joseph was,
Right.
you really want to burden him with all that English, all those English royalty women?
Right.
It's kind
Right.
of,
Right. Right. Yeah. No, the last thing Joseph wants to be keeping track of is Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So I'm saying, I think he's got bigger fish to fry.
yeah. So when adoptions in 1890, so we kind of talked that that's kind of a turning point. In the 1890s, like rebaptism stops being taught in the 1890s, and it's really weird where you have articles in the juvenile instructor teaching rebaptism as being a standing ordinance of the gospel for anyone who gathers. You should be rebaptized when you gather to kind of recommit yourself to the
Hmm.
fullness of the gospel. But then I think it was in 1895, if I'm remembering right, George Buchanan has a whole article saying how rebaptism was never a principle of the gospel. It was never. He says it was, maybe allowed as special permission by prophets, but it was never really. And he tried to. I was actually really disappointed when I saw this article. Like, I want to think highly of George Buchanan for all the things he did to be valiant in the gospel, but he wasn't perfect. And he was kind of proto correlation in some ways.
Sure.
And so he was trying to make it out like rebaptism was just about an external thing where if you screw up, it makes the community be more likely to accept you back if you. And I'm like, no, it was not about
Mm,
an external social thing. Brigham, when he talks about rebaptism, talks about it as an internal thing, that
yep.
you are, trying to change and you are trying to be better, more valiant in your testimony of Christ and be, more, to have those changes that accepting the atonement will bring into your life. And so, you know, 1890s are kind of a sad and interesting period. And so one of the things with the sealing principles that we haven't mentioned is that with women needing a faithful husband, part of that doctrine was, if your husband is, not somebody who takes the gospel seriously, if you're a woman who's faithful in the fullest of the gospel, um, that you should have somebody that you're sealed to eternally, even if you have a mortal husband who's not in the gospel. So, like, the example given is Benjamin F. Johnson. It says his mother had kind of been estranged from his father. And so, by the suggestion and counsel of Joseph Smith, she was sealed as a plural wife to John Smith. And you have other, and generally they would say, like, for if you've got an unbelieving husband, the general policy in the 1880s was you can't really get your endowments in it'd just be an awkward family context was kind of what was
Hmm.
for a woman with an unbelieving spouse in the time period. But if her husband died, they said you should have somebody that you're linked to, even if you're like an old lady, you should have a husband eternally so that you could have those blessings. And I guess another good example is Brigham Young's sister, who she had a love in life that wasn't in the fullness of the gospel, but she needed somebody to be sealed to. And so Joseph, and she's like, oh, I'm okay not being sealed. I'm okay with just being an angel in heaven. And then Joseph goes, sister, you do not know what you are saying. And he says, here, brother Brigham, you seal her to me. And so Brigham's telling that story, and he doesn't tell it. You don't know it's his sister until the very end of the story. He's telling it as kind of a humorous thing about the introduction of the plural marriage in Nauvoo. And he says, and that woman was my own sister, is what he said.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so that was considered, and so they didn't consider it safe for a woman to be sealed to a husband who rejected the fullness of the gospel. So that's the other you know another that's another aspect to working out the sealing lines with people on earth. And so in the scripture that I would point to for a lot of this is in what the epistle of John, it says, if we don't love those people we do know, how can we say we love God in heaven that we do not know, that we have not seen? If we that's the word he used seen, where he says, if we don't love those who we do see, how can we love God who we have not seen?
Right.
um and so the idea was working out these sealing lines with people on earth. And so a woman needs to be sealed to a man who she has confidence will be able to be exalted, was what was understood. So after the manifesto, in the 1890s, they kind of said, you know, they started to say, well, if a woman wants to choose, she can choose to be sealed to a husband who rejected the gospel, but we don't consider her safe. We don't consider it a safe decision.
Gotcha.
So they opened the door there, but then they slowly started, being more and more okay with it, is what Woodruff says. And when Woodruff does away with adoption at the April 1894 conference, he also says, and we're also doing away with this thing of women needing to be sealed to a faithful priesthood holder that had accepted the gospel and lived it in this life. So he does away with that at the same time, and he basically says, and I kind of started turning against that a while ago. He says, I clipped that one. I started clipping that one a while ago, or words to that effect, when he did away with adoption. And so when we get to the point where Woodruff is doing away with adoption, uh, so what's interesting is in 1890, it was Joseph F. Smith that argued against adoption, but George Buchanan still defended it. In 1894, in March of 1894, is when George Buchanan finally just turns against it, and he writes about that he thinks that we need to do something different in regards to this. And so, yeah, it's only a few weeks later that, Woodruff, conveniently gets this revelation to do away with adoption. And it is basically what Joseph F. Smith and George Buchanan were wanting him to do. And I think some important context for that time period is there's a statement by John W. Taylor in a state conference. I believe it's 1895 or 1896. He kind of says that Wilford Woodruff can no more run this church than a baby without the help of George Buchanan and Joseph F. Smith. So he's
Ooh.
basically kind of saying that, that the counselors are kind of important influences to running the show. That he's not really he's almost kind of saying that in some ways that Woodruff is kind of not fully capacitated to be running the church without their support, but he's kind of and so what Abraham Cannon kind of wrote about that is he felt that Joseph F. Smith was trying to, excuse me, not Joseph F. Smith, John W. Taylor was trying to talk about the importance of counselors, but it came across more as saying that Woodruff was not very capable of running the church in what he said. But, it's interesting that's those counselors that, turning against it, that, led to Woodruff also turning away from it. And Woodruff kind of, in a private meeting of church leaders, kind of throws previous leaders under the bus in some ways. So in the conference address announcing it, he doesn't really try to do it. He says, "Oh, they didn't understand it. They said they didn't under." So in the meeting of church leaders, he kind of says, we have more knowledge now. Like, we know better than what was known before." Um, you
Whew.
know, he's Yeah, and it's kind of, for me, it kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth, my mouth to hear this. So this is actually John M. Whitaker's diary, where he says President Woodruff. So this is April 5th, 1894. He says, um, President Woodruff spoke on temple work, explaining to the past many prominent people had been sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith, disregarding their parents. They were so anxious to be near to the prophet and neglecting their own lines. He said he had a revelation saying this was all wrong and such sealings were not right and would all have to be done over again. And we can't disregard our own progenitors, but all sealings must be done in the proper way. And he said that the Lord had revealed to him that hereafter all sealings must conform to the new information. In the past, such in some instances we have not understood clearly, and the former presidents of the church have not fully and clearly understood. Um, and so he basically says what Woodruff says: if you come to a murderer in your family line, to skip over the murderer and just seal back, as far as you can, and then seal the last one to Joseph Smith. So there still was part of the law of adoption in sealing the last one to Joseph Smith when they did away with it. Um, but even that gets dropped later on. We'll kind of talk about that in a minute. But the big example that he uses to argue against adoption sealings is he says, you never know what a man will do. Like, and he uses John D. Lee as an example. He says, a lot of people in Nauvoo were adopted to John D. Lee, and look what he did. He was involved with that heinous crime of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And so if they're linked to him, they'll have to go where he is. They'll have to go to hell with him. And so we shouldn't be sealed to a man because you never know what he will do. But that kind of logic doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because what you're going to instead be sealed to somebody who's never had the gospel, and you also don't know whether they would be valiant in the fullness of the gospel. So we're
Right.
not going to be sealed to men who we do know, because you don't know what they'll do, but we'll be sealed to men we don't know. Yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Um, and what's interesting is Woodruff kind of writes in his journal that he had this revelation on adoption. And I actually included this in a paper that I did on kind of giving a brief kind of history of the law of adoption. You might be able to see it on your screen. Let me unblur my screen. So Woodruff's writing saying, I had this revelation. So he's saying, I've received the following revelation on the law of adoption, and then just blank for a page and half a page on one page, half a page on the other page, and then he continues to the next day's entry. So it's kind of interesting. He says, I
Ooh.
had a revelation doing away with to or correcting the law of adoption, but he never actually
He never
puts
writes
it in
anything
his.
down.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of significant
That is
and telling.
significant.
Yeah, and that was in a paper I wrote called The Kingdom of God in a Family Capacity.
Okay, I'm going to ask
So
you a real pointed question here. Do you take that then that Wilford was lying about that?
I think he might have felt impressed, that he might have felt genuine, that I mean, he kind of, so he's very similar with George Buchanan. He does the work for, um, so his father was in the church, and he initially, his father was in the church but died before the endowments, is kind of his story. But his father was a faithful patriarch, and so he does the work for his father, and initially seals himself to his father, and then seals his father to Joseph Smith. But then as he's doing work for his other ancestors, he says he then, very similar to Canon, I think, where he's feeling the spirit, he's feeling like they're accepting the ordinances. And so he's kind of, I think, in my opinion, mistaking that as, oh, I should be sealed to them instead
Gotcha.
of them be sealed to me and to our family line. So I think that there's, I think it's part of that natural inclination. And I do think they tried to use the electioneering as an excuse. to do away with it. I think there were concerns. There were valid concerns about people who were working in the temples, like potentially electioneering or trying to use their position to say, hey, you need to be sealed to someone, you should be sealed to me. And I think those are valid concerns, but there's better ways to deal with them than to do away with the sealing principles as Joseph and Brigham taught him, in my opinion. So
100%, right? And look, I'm usually really, really sympathetic and charitable towards historic figures, right? Because we can read about their times and circumstances and get a real good feel for what they were going through, but we'll never truly know, right? Now, having said that, I think with the benefit of time, we can look back on this and see the folly, right? And interestingly enough, this isn't a folly that's over by any stretch of the imagination. One of the things when I left the LDS Church and I talked to my stake president, who was he worked for Bonneville Communications. He was either the stake president or one of his counselors. I can't remember. But I had made mention that I was disturbed by the removal of a covenant between husband and wife in the temple. And he said, yeah, oh, I can answer this one for you because I have to go have meetings with certain members of the 12. And he said, for the first time ever, there's more women than, or excuse me, there's more single people than married people in the temple. So we felt like it was appropriate to make that change to the covenants. And I asked him, I said, so if everybody was having a hard time living, if everyone was having a hard time not screwing around, would you get rid of the law of chastity? And he just kind of stopped for a second and looked at me. And at that point, the meeting was pretty much over. But this was still a pattern, right? We're, like,
I don't want to interrupt you too, but I believe you told me the story before, and you did you say you asked? Didn't he say something about being concerned about like men would use the covenant as an excuse to abuse their wives?
that was one of the things he talked about. Yep, is that it would lead to abuse, right? That there was instances where men weren't as good to their wives as what they should have been, and then that there were more married people, I mean, more single people than married people in the temple, and for those reasons, they took it out. And again, my contention is this: if someone had a hard time living a chaste life, that's not a law to get rid. That's not a reason to get rid of the covenant of chastity, right? It's stupid. But yet it's still continuing. And unfortunately, what we see here is that there really is no staying static in the gospel. You're either going to move forward or you're going to move backwards. You're either going to increase in knowledge and in testimony and in faith, or that's going to atrophy. There's no standing static. At some point, you've got to start moving. And if you aren't intentional about moving forward, you will move backwards.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Um, yeah, and so what I kind of thought was, telling were the seeds of a lot of the problems with things being rejected kind of start with Woodruff, and then under Heber J. Grant, it you know you dial it up 10, right? It just
Right.
goes astronomical. So Woodruff, when they're doing away with adoption, they're still saying seal the last one to Joseph Smith. Twice in his discourse, he's saying, trace your family lines as far back as you can. Quote, when you get to the end, let the last man be adopted to Joseph Smith, who stands at the head of the dispensation. And so then later on in the discourse, he says, when you get to the last man in the lineage, as I said before, we will adopt that man to the prophet Joseph, and then the prophet Joseph will take care of himself with regard to where he goes. So he mentions that, and then George Buchanan gives a sermon after him, kind of reiterating the same thing. And then he says, um, you know, so he goes on, he says, we'll be sealed to them, and there the lineage will be connected. So let's see. There's no doubt in my mind that so they're trying to say that, they think that Joseph Smith should be sealed to his own father. And well, I mean, first Woodruff kind of asked the question. He said, would it take away any of Joseph's glory if he's sealed to his father? Is kind of what he uses as an argument to seal yourself to your ancestors, kind of thing.
Right.
And so then Cannon kind of states it a bit more authoritatively, where he says, there's no doubt in my mind that the prophet Joseph would be sealed to his father. He will honor his father and mother. We will be sealed to them, and they and their lineage will doubtlessly be connected with him by the sealing ordinance as the head of this dispensation. They will have to be connected within him by some link or bond that will be created. If it doesn't already exist, as we all be connected. So he's kind of self-contradicting because he's saying we're all being linked back to Joseph Smith. So he's saying we're sealing ourselves to our lines, but we're all being linked back to Joseph Smith. But how's that working if you're doing away with adoption? So he says,
Right. Well,
but as a,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
um, so I guess I'll finish that quote where he says, we will all be connected with him because he is the head of the dispensation. But as a son, he will be honored by his ancestry and all who come within the range and under the jurisdiction of this dispensation. All such will necessarily be sealed by some bond to the prophet Joseph. In this way, we shall all be united, and there can be no question on our part as to the propriety of being all connected with Joseph, carrying up every lineage directly as far as we can, and then linking them on to the head of the dispensation. So there's something contradictory there where he's talking about, you know, Joseph's going to be sealed back, we're all going to be sealed back, but then we're all needing to be linked to Joseph anyway. So he's there's a kind of a self or a conundrum at least about how they're teaching it. And kind of Woodruff, there's a conundrum in how he's explaining it, where he says, will it take any glory from you if you're sealed to your ancestors who have not held the authority and of the priesthood that you've held? And he says you will still have that authority, that present, that position and that honor as their savior, kind of thing. And it's like, you're kind of contradicting, the two different
Yeah.
things. There's kind of a self contradiction there, and you kind of see it. There's somebody recently shared a picture that I thought was kind of interesting, a quote by Woodruff about work for the dead in 1898, where he said, quote, every father and mother has a great responsibility resting upon them to redeem their dead. Do not neglect it. When you get to the other side of the veil, if you have entered into these temples and redeemed your progenitors by the ordinance of the house of God, you will hold the keys of their redemption from eternity to eternity. Do not forget, do not neglect this. And so it's like, that's sounding like you're saying that you preside over them if you're holding the keys of their redemption to eternity after
Right.
performing their ordinance work. And so I shared that quote with a friend after I saw that. I was like, wow, that's sounding more like the pre 1894 ordinance. And he says, man, living in the 1890s would have been a very confusing time period.
No kidding. Ugh.
Yeah. So, and it's just kind of, I think the confusion really results from, people, when you start to reject, commandments that the Lord gives, when you start to reject revelations, when the Lord speaks, you're opening yourself up to deception. You're opening yourself up to confusion, by, if you lose the spirit, by, an implicit disobedience, by if the Lord says to do one thing and you choose to go the opposite direction, you're way more likely to get confused. And that's kind of what I really think happened with the 1890 manifesto. Was I don't think they were bad intentioned. I don't think they were evil. I think that they got confused is really the best, most charitable way to put, what happened in the mid 1890s.
You know,
Um,
we can see this in microcosm with just the temple endowment itself, right? Someone once asked me why I thought it was that there were so many changes to the ordinance. And I said, well, because the ordinances build on themselves. So if as you're going through that ordinance, if you change one thing, you may not be fully aware of what the downstream consequences are, right? And what my sense is, as I look at all the temple changes happening, is that you're always chasing it, right? Okay, well, if we get rid of this, oh, look at that, we're gonna have to get rid of that now, right? Or else that doesn't make sense and it doesn't flow right. And so we can see this in microcosm within the temple ordinance itself, that once you start changing it, you're always chasing it from that point forward to try to make it right again. Um, and I think we're seeing it on the macro here with the whole gospel, right? In that if you get rid of one thing, you are going to chase something else, and confusion lies at the door at that point. And any semblance that you had of bringing order out of chaos that Joseph presented to us through the impartation of that knowledge of God, it will become confusing to everyone else as well. And that's always my the song that I sing when someone says, maybe we should change this. I'm like, well, have we thought about the unintended consequences 3 steps down the road? Because if not, you shouldn't change it.
Yep, yep, amen. I think that you need to be very cautious when you're talking about, and really it's, you know, some of the first changes to the endowment, I think, were very mundane. Like, Woodruff actually kind of started doing very slight, small changes in the 1890s. And then Grant, I mean, Joseph F. Smith then starts, he removes the lecture at the Veil in the early 1900s. And then Grant goes bigger. And it just kind of, it's a snowball effect
Mhm.
of changing things. And you know, it's, you lose blessings when you take away, knowledge and the principles of the gospel. It's just
Absolutely.
the way to put it. And so what's interesting with Grant is, so we read those quotes from, I specifically read those quotes from Woodruff and George Q. Cannon's discourses about how they're going to seal the last one to Joseph Smith. And so, I think that's interesting that they still kind of knew that there needed to be some sort of adoption going on. They knew that something needed to go on there. But what's interesting is by the time the 1920s roll around and Heber J. Grant's the president of the church, when those discourses by Wilford Woodruff and George Q. Cannon are reprinted in the 1920s, they deliberately ellipse out those parts of the discourses about sealing the last one to Joseph Smith. They ellipse out two. I initially thought it was just one comment in Woodruff's discourse, and I was reading through it in the what magazine? It was the Utah Genealogical and Historical Magazine, and I was reading through it and I realized, wait, there's another part that's ellipsed out. Let me go back to the Millennial Star and see what was removed. And I saw it was another reference to it. And I was like, oh, that's that's a bit more, there's something if you're ellipsing multiple thing
Yeah.
references to the same thing. And then more recently, I read George Buchanan's sermon, and I noticed that there was a big part, there was dot 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 3 ellipses right in the discourse. I'm like, well, I better go back to the original, and sure enough, it's him saying the same thing, even several sentences being ellipsed out in
Mhm.
his. And I think if you were honest about it, you would admit what they believed. And uh, uh, could Heber J. Grant just be bold enough to say, yeah, Woodruff and George Buchanan didn't quite have it figured out, but now we have it figured out. We don't need to do that seal the last one to Joseph. They were just confused, and finally we've got the temple figured out. Is kind of, well, if they were bold enough to say that.
Right.
Um, and so what's interesting is that's not the only thing that I noticed that was kind of um ellipsed out, is that Brigham, so in the also in the Utah Genealogical and Historical Magazine, they printed a discourse that Brigham gave. It was a family meeting in Nauvoo in January of 1845. And this is a very important discourse because Brigham's talking about, that there's this new order of the kingdom of God that the saints aren't really familiar with yet. and he says that, don't be startled. I mean, well, before I get to that, the comment that was removed, um, before I get to the comment that was removed, he talks about, that this is going to be a family order where men will rise up as kings and priests and hold the keys, to bless their families and preside over their families. And at the very end of the discourse, he talks about, what about the dead being linked to those who are their um, relatives who perform the ordinances for them. And what was interesting was realizing that that comment was left out of
Mhm.
the reprint of it in the genealogical magazine. But fortunately, the church had the originals in the archives, and um, that discourse. We have that discourse thanks to others publishing it, but just consider it interesting. I'm trying to I'm trying to find the quote. I'm wondering why I can't. Um, oh, here it is. I found it. So this is so he said, this is a subject relating to the baptism for the dead. We will tell you when the temple is finished how to redeem your dead. I want to tell you now, don't be scared, don't be frightened at what I tell you. The church does not understand the doctrine that Joseph taught, yet it is plain as the sun at noonday. The order of redeeming our relatives originated in the kingdom of heaven. If our progenitors had kept their records as the Jews anciently did, they would be able to tell exactly where they came from and see where they run down in one straight line. We have hundreds ready to be baptized for the dead. Suppose brother Joseph or Hiram or William came along. He picks up 300 or 400. He that has the greatest power will take them. Suppose someone is baptized for my relations, and I afterwards find time, I will go and be baptized for them, and I will hold them all. Suppose Joseph was alive, he could go and be baptized for them and hold them all in spite of all earth and hell. There is a law by which all the human family will be redeemed. So that paragraph was kind of left out in the republished, but it's kind of talking about whoever has, and so he said Joseph would obviously have the best claim, but for people who he wants to have directly linked to him. But he said, but Brigham's saying equally, if somebody's doing work for my progenitors and I find the time and I want to have them linked to me, then I can do the ordinances and have that link created. If I have the better claim to them, basically. And so that I can see there being concerns about the people getting in this kingdom building
Right.
mentality. But if you have the right spirit about it, it shouldn't be about that at all. It's about helping others, not trying to aggrandize yourself. I mean, but as we've talked about, it's the principle Joseph taught was that aggrandizement is a correct principle if you're equally trying to aggrandize others. It's not just um there's the quote in the history of the church that's commonly cited, but it's not um there's a different account of it that's not as commonly quoted by Oliver B. Huntington that I really like, where he recalls what he was present for that discourse. He said, quote, I heard Joseph Smith say something like this. Some people say that it is not right to seek to aggrandize one's own self, that self-aggrandizement is not a good principle. But says he, Joseph, I say it is a true and godlike principle, but it can only be done permanently, justly, and righteously in only one way or upon only one plan in order to be eternal in its durability. If any person will build up others, benefit, bless, and permanently aggrandize others, he in turn will be aggrandized eternally. And that is the only principle or plan which it can be done and remain forever.
Wow.
And so I think that's the secret to exaltation
I think
is
so.
is in that service for other people and losing yourself in the service of others. So
I couldn't agree more. And look, I think there's something else we can take from this discussion too about this, which is just because you don't understand something doesn't mean you should jettison it, right? Get rid of it, right? Um, we saw what happened here with the law of adoption by doing that, right? Sometimes you just need to teach things over and over and over again and figure out a better way of communicating it, because just jettisoning a practice, especially in these matters, will only lead to further um, capitulation on important things. And we need to do better than that as a people.
Mhm. Amen. I think, that's an important thing. And I think that when we put these principles in, when we understand the principles better, we're in a better position to explain the gospel to others, and it makes more sense. And so I think it is, when you understand, this, those quotes that I heard before, like there's actually statement, we're talking about the Orson F. Whitney statement about parents who are faithful will be able to reach out, and the tentacles of divine providence will be able to, extend salvation to them eventually, if not in this life, and it will eventually be able to, be saved. And there are similar quotes where Brigham Young said the same thing, Lorenzo Snow said the same thing. um and you don't understand those until you understand the sealing principles. When you understand
Right.
the work, that goes into it, the work for the dead, the kingdom building. And so, um even if somebody who is in your family isn't, if they go astray, as long as you continue to be valiant, you will be able to continually offer, blessings to them. You will be, and just because someone is living in such a way that they might go to a different kingdom doesn't mean that you can't go and reach out to them and try to help uplift them, and they can eventually change and grow and progress in the gospel. So don't ever give up hope on people, especially those who are in your family that you cherish and who you want to see become, all that God intends for us to be. So,
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. That part about not giving up is huge. Too often, and I want to be generous here, but too often I've heard people almost explain it away too passively, where they're like, well, God lost a third of his children, right? And don't get me wrong, that is true. And that is not an indictment upon our Father in heaven. However, that does not mean we get to just take it easy and rest because you know what? It happened to him, right? I don't think God would be pleased with us giving that kind of an excuse. Um, Look, I have kids outside the faith right now. Doesn't mean I'm not going to try like hell every time I get an opportunity, and it's a well placed opportunity to bring them back, right? And that not giving up thing is huge. Um, because we really don't know who will accept the gospel, right? We really don't. Our job is to present the offer and then see if they'll take it. I was the guy who was the least likely to become a Mormon, doubly so for a fundamentalist, right? And um, nonetheless, Amber made the offer, and I accepted begrudgingly, I might add, but accepted the offer to at least learn about it, and this is where I am now. So I don't know if that's a good thing or if that's a cautionary tale. I got to think that through. But anyway, um,
very similar case. Like I could not have, growing up, I wouldn't have seen myself, on the path that I'm on. And I think it's, it really shows that, God can touch and reach out to anyone and help them. He knows our hearts, and he knows if we're, um, susceptible to being willing to change, and he will extend those offers. And, we can be instruments to help him in doing that work to extend, the gospel to those who otherwise wouldn't be receptive to it. So,
I will never quite comprehend how someone couldn't get fired up over temple work, right? Because here's an opportunity to not just benefit from, but also participate in a tiny portion of the atonement, right? Because we do get to do something for our ancestors that they can't do for themselves. And that's very much standing as a savior on Mount Zion. And I, look, the temple is so integral, and those ordinances are so integral to Mormonism, they cannot be separated. Um, and unless we have a good working understanding of all of them, we will end up lacking at some point. And as you pointed out with some of the scriptures and some of the comments you read, this is important stuff. This is the big leagues, right? And you got to be dialed in, and we got to do it right. And
Amen.
it's interesting to see that it doesn't take long for it to get off course either. Um,
Yeah,
but
that's just a cautionary tale. And in fundamentalism, in adoption, there I've seen, I'm not personally seen, but I've heard those cautionary stories of people who get really get really excited about adoption and misuse it in the ways that Brigham warned about, and was that Brigham witnessed. It's kind of history kind of repeats itself. I mean, there's also been lots of, I don't want to minimize, but there's also been lots of cases of people who I think tried to do it right. And
mm-hmm.
and I think that it can be a wonderful blessing for those who try to live these principles right in a way to try to unite people rather than divide people. So
Amen.
that's the big thing. I think that the core thing I would take home from the law of adoption is that the saints are intended to be one big family. And I think fundamentalists, if you haven't interacted with Dave, you should, he doesn't bite and he is brotherly to everyone. Like, I think, that's the spirit that we need to have. Is, as Brigham Young said, he said, I have just as much love for a man who's adopted to Heber C. Kimball or John Taylor. We are one family. And that's what we need to learn about with adoption, is that it's about the saints being one big family. So,
Amen.
um, I hope that's what we can all strive to be in learning about these principles and striving to apply them. So
Awesome. Well, dude, I always learn something every time we talk, and I did again tonight. And just can't tell you how much I love our conversations, and I appreciate you being on.
well, it's been a pleasure having me here, and letting me share this, and talking about these ideas with you, because I think that you know these conversations are very important for us to learn about these ideas and work through and kind of better understand them. So I really appreciate you inviting me on to discuss
Oh,
this.
like I said, you got a standing invitation. Anytime you want to come on, you just got to give me a call. But there is another important matter I did want to touch on briefly, and that is, dude, how are you gonna get some brisket all the way out there in Utah now? I mean, I'm not close anymore. You can't just swing in. You're gonna have to make a trip to Missouri.
Yeah, yep. That's the unfortunate thing about Dave's barbecues have uh the gathering place for Dave's barbecues has
Whoa.
fundamentally changed from Orem, Utah to is it Southern Missouri? So
Southwest Missouri. Yep.
yep.
Southwest
So
Missouri. But you
definitely
know
gonna
what?
have to come out there eventually.
You're gonna have to come out here, and I may have to just make a roadie up there and just drag the smoker up with me and just do one up there too. So I definitely miss having those, and that's something I seek to remedy quickly. So, well, brother, it was fun as always. Hang out for 5 minutes, all right?
All right, sounds good.
All right, bye
Great talking with
everybody.
you, Dave.